Jim Nielsen joining.
Hi, sir.
Yeah. Jim Nielsen joining you.
Hello, sir. We hear you coming in loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, I got it.
All right, good afternoon. I'm going to call the joint oversight hearing of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, the Assembly Transportation Committee, and the Senate Transportation Committee to order. Due to ongoing COVID-19 safety considerations, we are practicing physical distancing here in the hearing room and throughout the Capitol building. So we are only able to have a limited number of people watch and participate in the hearing in person. We are also requiring that masks be worn and physical distancing be maintained by all members of the public testifying, whether here in the room or at a video conferencing site. If you do not have a mask, we can provide one for you. We have a few different options for the public to participate. For the public here in the room, when we reach the public comment portion of the agenda, I would ask that any member of the public here in the room to please approach the mic, one person at a time, and please maintain social distancing as you move around the room. I would ask that the public not touch the microphone. You can exit the hearing room once you are done providing your comment or return to your seat. Please be sure to observe physical distancing upon leaving the Capitol, including limiting the elevator use to one person at a time. For remote witnesses, our panelists from the California State Auditor's Office and the California Air Resources Board will be testifying remotely today. These witnesses will appear on the screen so members can watch their testimony live from outside of the hearing room and also ask them questions. For dial-in public comment, we will also be using a moderated telephone service for public comment. The call-in number for this hearing is 877-692-8957. Again, that number is 877-692-8957. And the access code is 13154202. The access code is 13154202. You can also find this number on the Assembly website and on your TV screen. The operator on the line will give you instructions on how to be placed in queue to provide your public comment. If you are calling in, please eliminate all background noise. This includes muting your live stream broadcast and your smart devices to reduce the sound distortion. We may need to limit how long each person has to provide public comment, as we will need to exit this hearing room around 5 p.m. I also want to note that we will not tolerate disruptions, so we can keep this hearing on track. That said, thank you all for your patience. Now moving on to our hearing. Today we will be discussing the findings and recommendations identified by the state auditor in the audit report released just last month titled California Air Resources Board, Improved Program Measurement would help California work more strategically to meet its climate. First, I want to thank Senator Bradford for requesting this audit regarding the transportation-related greenhouse gas reduction programs overseen by CARB. This is a very important issue. California has made tremendous strides in reducing GHG, improving public health for many, and addressing climate change. However, there are still large areas of our state, I know like for the Central Valley, for instance, where I reside, where the air quality ranks among the worst in the nation. Polluted air is linked to a variety of health concerns ranging from serious diseases or even premature death. Not only are fellow Californians living in polluted areas where they are experiencing higher health risks, but some are also living in extreme poverty. Low-income communities and individuals have carried the disproportionate burden of environmental injustice. Therefore, it is critical that, in addition to reducing GHG emissions, the programs overseen by CARB should also achieve socioeconomic benefits, particularly for those residing in disadvantaged and low-income communities. Moreover, I believe that GHG policies and programs in the transportation sector must be applied fairly and equitably in order for them to be effective. However, in late 2018, the Legislative Analyst's Office released a report on the economic impacts and benefits of California's statutory GHG emission goals, and that left me and many others with more questions than answers. The report found that the overall economic impacts and benefits of these programs and policies are largely unclear. The LAO's findings left me wondering how the state could spend billions of dollars on incentive programs aimed at lowering GHG but lack program measurements to guide its investments. The audit report that was released by the state auditor last month certainly raises similar questions and concerns. Specifically, it found that CARB has not done enough to measure the GHG emission reductions in its individual transportation programs. Specifically, it has not collected or evaluated sufficient data to allow it to determine whether or how its incentive programs reduce GHG emissions. Without program measurements, we do not know the value for each dollar we are investing to determine whether we are having the best impact for that dollar in our most disadvantaged communities. Additionally, the report found that CARB has not consistently collected or analyzed data to determine whether some of its programs provide the socioeconomic benefits to Californians living in environmentally disadvantaged communities as well as low and moderate income communities. I look forward to a robust and much needed discussion today regarding the audit report with the agency in implementing those recommendations and strategies to achieve California's climate goals. At this time, I do want to mention another housekeeping item before we proceed forward. I have a few housekeeping items to ensure we can hear from everyone. I ask that the panel keep their presentations to the time allotted. And with that, let me go ahead and invite either Assemblymember Friedman or Senator Gonzalez for opening remarks.
Okay, well, I first want to thank my colleagues for bringing light this very important topic and for allowing CARB to highlight their work as well and for us to do a deep dive a little bit into their work. Climate change right now is certainly on everyone's mind, and if you believe in science, which I do, and listen to the scientists, climate change and climate impacts in the future, if we don't take radical action, are going to be the biggest challenge that anyone in recent memory has ever faced. It's something that I worry about every day. I worry about my daughter and the planet that she's going to inherit. I worry about our own state and our constituents and how they will adjust to climate change, to drought, to the types of crops that we're able to or not able to grow in California, to what's going to happen to our coastline, to our communities. This is something that we need to take extremely seriously. Now, the transportation sector has struggled for many years with GHG reductions, and it continues to struggle. And in my mind, it's not just because of the type of fuel that's used, it also has to do with land use policies and how we allow people or don't allow people to move around their communities. It's about where we live, it's about where we can afford to live, it's about what we need to get to have our lives. And many of these issues go well beyond CARB's authority. And so I think as we move forward, it's important to remember that there's a lot of factors that go into how people move around their community, how they drive, and what CARB is able to do and not able to do. Now, I want to say, just kind of outside of this topic a little, that I think that it's really important as we move forward that we de-silo a lot of these conversations. Transportation, land use, housing, they're all part of a larger conversation that needs to be more holistic. I am chairing a new select committee on urban development to combat climate change, and I invite all of you to participate in that. I do today want to dive in to talk about feasible, realistic changes that can be made, with the understanding that the answers to some of these questions might very well be unknowable. And I hope to come away today with an understanding of how the legislature and the administration can work together to better tackle this huge challenge and our goals. And thanks again for for holding this hearing.
All right. Thank you, Chairwoman Friedman. We'll move now to our Senate Transportation Chair, Senator Lena Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chair Salas. I'd like to first start by thanking you, the Chair of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, as well as Chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee, Laura Friedman, who's been a partner with me over the last couple months in transportation issue and policies. As we know, statewide, more than 28 million Californians live in areas that exceed ozone and particulate matter standards. One of those happens to be in my own district. There are many low-income and disadvantaged communities that experience significantly higher pollutant levels, which have serious health impacts. My district includes the Port of Long Beach and part of the 710 corridor, which are huge job drivers, but they also create severe air quality challenges. So we need a strategic and dedicated investment opportunity and programs to develop clean freight corridors and get clean, heavy-duty vehicles and port equipment in use along our corridors for better air quality improvement. And on the light-duty side, half of all EVs sold in the U.S. have been right here in California, so we're doing something right, but it's not enough to make sure that everyone can participate in the zero-emission future, addressing barriers, and ensuring, again, that low-income individuals are at the front of the line. The legislature has created or funded many programs to achieve these benefits, and of course this year we're considering a $1.5 billion clean transportation proposal from the governor across incentives and infrastructures. I'm encouraged that the audit has found some opportunities where they've exceeded minimum spending requirements for low-income communities, but we have to look deeper than that high-level metric at the programs that are available now, and ensuring that their intended outcomes are really achieving what we need for these communities. We know that California has a lot more to do, and asking the right questions and ensuring that they're tough questions and analyzing the right information and using it to improve existing programs can definitely help us get here, and I know this committee can certainly do that. With that, again, I want to say thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to move to Senator Laird, the Vice Chair of the Joint Legislative Joint Legislative Audit Committee, but at this point I'd like to update the access code. The access code has been updated for the call-in number. The call-in number again was 877-692-8957. The updated access code is 4202-1315. Again, that access code is 4202-1315. And with that, we'll move to Senator Laird, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate having the hearing and be here with both transportation chairs as well. I was in the legislature 15 years ago when AB 32 was adopted. And it was basically a bipartisan effort passed by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Republican governor to do at the state level what was walked away from at the national level. There were the Kyoto Accords, and AB 32 basically said we would apply those to California in the absence of our federal government walking away from them. And it set the goal that we would, by 2020, go back to the emissions level, greenhouse gas emissions level, by 1990. That bill placed the authority for that program and all the supporting fiscal and administrative authority within the California Air Resources Board. That's what brought us here today. And we have met those goals. That very high goal was met. So, and now the legislature with the governor has set new goals on both that and other climate activities. So it's very appropriate that we do a check-in about whether the administrative process is working and it's effective, whether environmental justice goals are being met, whether we have measurements to see. But it's also appropriate not to take our eye off these goals. That is what is in front of us, because the nation looks to California for our leadership on these issues, and we've provided it. So I think this hearing will give us a good chance to have a check-in, but I just want to make sure we don't take our eye off of where we have to head. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to make opening comments.
All right. Thank you, Senator Laird. With that, we will go ahead and move to our first panel. This is agenda item number 2, overview of the audit of the California Air Resources Board. We have joining us our California State Auditor, Elaine Howell, Tammy Lozano, Audit Principal, and Mark Reinardi, Audit Supervisor. And as we're getting ready for them, I do want to just mention and thank the people that are here in attendance, which is Assemblymember Friedman, Senator Gonzalez, Assemblymember Frazier, Senator Laird, Assemblymember Fong, Senator Dowley. And remotely, we have, I believe, 23 members joining us remotely. That's Assemblymember Kiley, Assemblymember Rubio, Assemblymember Vopel, Senator Becker, Senator Glazier, Senator Hertzberg, Senator Nielsen, Assemblymember Gibson, Assemblymember Nazarian, Assemblymember Nguyen, Assemblymember O'Donnell, Assemblymember Ward, Assemblymember Wick, Senator Bates, Senator Archuleta, Senator McGuire, Senator Melendez, Senator Min, Senator Rubio, Senator Skinner, Senator Wachowski, Senator Allen, Assemblymember Cunningham, Assemblymember Carra, and Assemblymember Lee. And with that, let's go ahead and move to our California Resources Board panel, please.
Good afternoon, members. My name is Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor, and Mark Reinerty and I will be presenting some information related to an audit we issued in February as to CARB and its efforts to implement AB 32 and other programs. And so we have three key issues that we're going to go over. We provided a packet of four-page packet to the committee. I'm going to be reviewing and going over the first page, and then Mr. Reinerty will step you through the following 3 pages. And basically what those pages will do will illustrate each of the key issues that I'm going to discuss. So the first issue, as some of the members that introduced, Member Friedman, Mr. Salas, and Gonzalez, is there are important programs that California administers. But what we are concerned about in the first issue is whether or not CARB is able to properly measure the effect of those programs, because we have regulatory programs, required programs, and then we also certainly have incentive programs, and those programs in many cases work together. The issue we have in California is CARB doesn't have the ability, or doesn't at this point in time have the capability of measuring the distinction between what GHG emission benefits is California receiving from its regulatory programs versus its incentive programs. The reason that's important is as California decides to invest more and more dollars into incentive programs, we need to make sure we're investing in the programs that are most beneficial to the state of California in reducing GHG emissions, and certainly creating those socioeconomic benefits for communities, disadvantaged communities, low-income communities. So the first key issue is whether or not CARB, and we found that CARB doesn't have the ability right now. We think they can and should be able to identify the benefits derived from its regulatory programs versus its incentive programs. The reason this is critically important as well, in addition to investing in the appropriate programs, is we have a very aggressive goal of reducing GHG emissions by 2030, and it has to be reduced significantly. We're going to be speaking about the transportation sector. That's specifically what the audit committee, Mr. Bradford's request, asked us to look at, because the transportation sector, passenger vehicles, trucks, heavy-duty trucks, et cetera, are major contributors to emissions in California, greenhouse gases. So that's the sector that California really needs to focus on. In fact, that sector over the past several years continues to show an increase in emissions rather than a decrease in emissions. So there really does need to be a focus on this particular sector and those regulatory programs as well as the incentive programs. So that's the first issue that we identified in the report, and Mr. Reinerty will step you through some more specifics related to that. The second issue is the socioeconomic benefits. The legislature clearly had intention that some of these programs would benefit disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and actually required CARB to invest a certain amount of funding in those communities, 25% in disadvantaged, 10% in low income. In the aggregate, California is doing that. We are investing more than that, those particular percentages. The problem we found with this particular area is CARB not doing as good a job as it should and is required to do to measure whether or not those socioeconomic benefits are occurring in those communities. Specifically talking about low-income communities and some of the job training programs that CARB intended to establish and fund, whether or not those programs are providing job training to individuals in low-income communities so they can gain employment in this industry. In addition, there were some requirements related to job creation, the types of jobs that these programs are supporting. And so we expected to see better measurement by CARB as to those benefits. And in fact, CARB's own guidelines from 2015, they established in 2015, required them to track some of this information, and they are not doing as good a job in tracking and certainly reporting this information to the legislature as they could and should be doing. So in the area of socioeconomic benefits, even though in the aggregate, again, they are investing in disadvantaged communities and low-income communities, the important aspect is, are they measuring by individual communities, by regions within the state? Are they measuring to determine whether jobs are being created, job training is being supported, individuals are receiving benefits that make their lives better? One particular program, as an example, we mentioned in the report, is a financial assistance program. This is a program where low-income individuals can either receive a grant or financial assistance to be able to purchase a zero-emission vehicle. And where we're expecting CARB to be able to track that information is how many individuals are receiving those types of loans. Is the loan being paid off? Because one of the benefits to those individuals is not just the vehicle, but them actually increasing their credit worthiness or their financial situation, because now they have a vehicle. It may affect their ability to get a job and reduce their transportation costs, those sorts of things. Those are the kinds of things that I think the legislature, in enacting legislation or passing legislation back in 2016 and again in 2017, really expected CARB to be tracking this type of information at this more specific level rather than just in the aggregate. The third area is tying to the first two areas, and that is the information that CARB reports to the legislature. Clearly, this is a very important issue to the legislature in California, the administration in California, and to be able to be partners with CARB, the legislature needs to have the appropriate information to make informed decisions as to where do we invest our money, as Senator Gonzalez indicated, where do we get the best bang for the buck, as a state. And if we aren't measuring the benefits of these incentive programs, we don't know as a state whether or not those are the programs we should continue to support, or we don't know what do we need to do to modify this particular program to make it more beneficial to the state of California, to the people of the state of California, and certainly to reduce GHG emissions. So we had a multitude of recommendations to the ARB, CARB, requiring better tracking of data, better analysis of data, separating the results of their regulatory programs versus their incentive programs, providing all of this information to the legislature and the public so people really do understand which programs are working, which programs perhaps are not working as well, maybe need to be modified or maybe need to be eliminated. So I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Reinerty. He's going to step you through the next three pages. It's just 3 more pages of the graphics package, and those 3 pages will illustrate some of what I was just discussing. So I'll hand it off to Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, chairs, members of the committees. For the record, my name is Mark Reinerty. I was the audit supervisor on this project. As the state auditor said, I'm going to walk you through in slightly more detail some of the issue areas that she covered and touch on our recommendations for those areas. The first area I'd like to talk about has to do with the state of emissions in California, and I won't belabor that discussion because obviously folks here are familiar and we've covered some of that already. But if you would turn to page 2 of your packet, you'll see a figure we present in the report that shows that although, yes, the year 2020 GHG emissions goals have been met, California still has a long way to go to meet its 2030 goals and beyond. Specifically, as of the most recent data, California needs to reduce total GHG emissions by another 40% in a given year to reach its 2030 goals. And as has been discussed, transportation is a huge element to that effort. Currently, transportation accounts for about 40% of emissions in the state, and it has been that most stubborn sector in terms of not wanting to follow some of the gains we've seen in electrical power generation, for example, the benefits of solar and hydroelectric. So transportation continues to be an area where we hope that there's a lot of opportunity for getting return on investment. To that end, CARB operates a wide range of programs directed at different sectors of transportation, such as different vehicle types, passenger vehicles, light-duty trucks, all the way up to heavy-duty trucks and transit buses, even freight and shipping. And those objectives cover goals that CARB wants to see achieved in those vehicle areas in order to translate to reductions in overall transportation emissions. And to do that, as the state auditor said, CARB programs fall into generally two different categories: regulatory programs and incentive programs. So we reviewed groups of both programs across a wide range of vehicle types and transportation areas. Regulatory programs consist of the regulations and the enforcement and measurement of compliance with those regulations. Generally, those regulations may be directed at vehicle manufacturers, some kind of more nascent regulations directed at some on the purchase side, but they would require the production and in some cases the sale of either specific types of clean vehicles or mandate the overall efficiency or cleanliness of manufacturers' kind of overall offerings of vehicles. And then on the incentive side, those are programs that are generally directed at consumers. And those might be individual Californians looking to buy a new vehicle, or they may be transit authorities or companies interested in more heavy-duty vehicles such as trucks and buses. And the very purpose of those incentive programs is to motivate consumers to go out and purchase the cleaner vehicle than they otherwise would. That's what we're really talking about when we look at the suite of transportation programs we're going to discuss today, is getting those cleaner vehicles out on the road and keeping them there. That is going to generate the reduction over what would otherwise happen that we need to see in the transportation sector. So with that, I'd ask you to turn to page 3, and I'll get a little into an example of some of these programs and how they operate and what our findings were with respect to CARB's administration of those programs. So we're going to focus on here is the objective related to zero emission vehicles in California. We think that's an illustrative example. People are familiar with vehicles and the programs, but as I alluded to, our team reviewed programs across many different vehicle types, including agricultural equipment, trucks, and buses. So we're obviously happy to answer any questions you might have about those other programs. But for the sake of kind of illustrating our conclusions, we'll focus on the ZEV, or the zero emission vehicle objective here today. The objective as put out forth in CARB's scoping plan, and this is backed up by a series of executive orders, is to put 1.5 million ZEVs in California roads by 2025 and a total of 5 million on those roads by 2030. So it's an ambitious goal. In order to accomplish that, CARB is operating programs that both contribute toward these objectives. So that's what the state auditor was saying. These programs work together or potentially overlap. And our charge was to look and see how well CARB designs and measures those programs to account for their individual contributions towards these objectives. These objectives are what are going to get us to our 2030 goal. So on the regulatory side, the most notable regulatory program there is the ZEV regulation. That requires California manufacturers to manufacture and sell certain proportions of vehicles in the state of California every year. So a proportion of their total sales has to be ZEV vehicles. On the incentive side, CARB operates numerous incentive programs that are targeted at these very same vehicles. Those are some of those well-known programs are CVRP, that's a consumer vehicle rebate program. And then there are also some programs that are slightly smaller in size, including the Clean Cars for All program and the financing assistance program. But in all cases, those programs provide financial incentives to consumers to motivate them to purchase a clean vehicle. So already you're seeing the overlap. There's a regulation that requires the sale of these vehicles in part, and then money provided to consumers to encourage them to purchase the vehicles. Those are the programs within CARB's control. There are also numerous programs that are outside of CARB's direct control, including federal tax incentives, consumer preferences, and state programs like the high occupancy vehicle lane. So you can see where the overlap and the complication starts to occur. Unfortunately, our review found that CARB does not do enough to coordinate its measurement of overlapping regulatory and incentive programs. That has to do with on the front end, it doesn't do enough in the design and implementation status to ensure that programs account for one another. That is, when they develop a regulation program, they're not necessarily accounting for the influence of the incentive programs, and vice versa. They're not accounting for regulatory programs that might require ZEV sales when they put into place something like CVRP, or rather when they go back to the table and determine whether they should refund CVRP, make any changes to it, etc. That issue carries on through kind of the measurement of these programs. We found that when the way that CARB measures compliance with its regulatory programs does not translate easily to how it talks about its incentive programs. That is, the compliance with its regulatory programs are not focused on the number of vehicles necessarily, whereas that is how CARB tracks and reports on the incentive program. So already CARB has put itself in a position where it's difficult for its two different programs to talk to one another in terms of their outcomes. And then there's a large question related to consumer behavior. Again, the purpose of these incentive programs is to get consumers to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do by making it a more attractive proposition. However, we found that CARB generally cannot demonstrate that its incentive programs do that. One reason they cannot is that CARB generally doesn't actually ask its participants whether or not the incentive program was instrumental or was the deciding factor in their decision to purchase a clean vehicle. And so if that's not the case, then it's difficult for CARB to assign credit for that purchase to the incentive program. That's important because, again, all these benefits flow from the influence of the incentive program on a purchase decision, and knowing how effective that program is requires disentangling that benefit from something like the regulation. In the case of CVRP, which is the one program we reviewed where CARB actually measures and surveys its participants about what motivated them to purchase the vehicle, about half of people, slightly less than half of people, say they would have purchased the vehicle even without the CVRP rebate. And so what we noted, however, is that CARB has done very little in that program or any of its other related programs to determine, basically to determine what that means in terms of the program's efficacy, and to make changes to the program that would increase its effectiveness in motivating consumers to take the step they wouldn't otherwise do, reduce the number of what we call in the report free riders. So in order to do that, CARB needs to be collecting more information on not just its participants, but also other factors that might drive decisions related to consumers' purchases, such as these external factors like federal tax credits, consumer preference, et cetera. And so CARB really has a lot of work to do in that area. And these have implications for short-term reporting and for long-term reporting about GHG emissions. On the short end, as the state auditor alluded to at the beginning, by attributing every vehicle that a program pays for to its GHG emissions reporting to the legislature, CARB is overstating the GHG emissions that its programs achieve. And in short, it's taking credit for CVRP for every rebate that CVRP pays out without taking account for the influence of things like regulations requiring sale, without taking account for the things like consumer preference that would have driven them to purchase the vehicle even without CVRP. That has a short-term effect of also obscuring the program's cost effectiveness, because if they're taking credit for larger amounts of GHG reductions than they actually are responsible for, that might make them look more cost effective or efficient than they might in reality be. And then these have longer term consequences in terms of CARB's goals of using these programs to generate self-sustainability among these new technology vehicles. So using incentives to bring ZEV technology, to bring clean bus technology to the point where incentives are no longer needed, and they can be on the fast track to achieving those objectives about putting those vehicles on the road. So there are short-term and long-term implications for program design and for reporting to the legislature that stem from these gaps we identified. As a result, we make a series of recommendations that, as has been stated, focus on improved data collection, improved data analysis. Some of those are as simple as coordinating the metrics being used. Others are relatively simple in terms of expanding CARB survey activities and ensuring that it's collecting information from participants who are already, willing participants receiving a financial benefit from the program. And then, using that information about behavior, about the regulatory program's impact to, on an iterative basis, improve the measurement of the program's GHG emissions reductions in its reports to the legislature. And because we expect that to potentially be an ongoing process, we've also recommended that CARB keep its board and the legislature appraised of its progress. Where is it able to identify this information? Is it having problems collecting said information? That way, the legislature has more transparency about the reliability of the tools it's using to allocate this money every year, and can potentially, provide assistance to CARB if CARB is running up against administrative or other hurdles in performing this enhanced measurement. So the last area I'll speak about today has to do with the socioeconomic goals associated with some of these programs. As has been stated, there are some broad goals that kind of pertain to the entirety of the cap and trades funded programs in the state. Those do pertain to things like job creation and the disadvantaged community and low-income community, spending requirements that have been discussed. However, there are also very specific program goals that CARB has demonstrated, or has rather claimed for its programs, that relate to things like increasing participants' credit scores, as the state auditor summarized in her remarks, enabling participants to travel outside of their communities because now they have access to a rideshare program to allow them to get to doctor's appointments or to grocery stores they couldn't previously access. Even claims about maximizing, broadly maximizing participants' economic opportunities because now they have a more reliable, less expensive source of transportation that can get them to jobs they couldn't otherwise work and get them there reliably. However, when we look at what CARB is actually measuring and reporting, it really is just limited to those legally required dollar spending in disadvantaged low-income communities. And those are important metrics, but they're at probably the highest level, the broadest level of detail that CARB could possibly be reporting in some of these areas. And so when our team went to figure out what was happening between this gap about the benefits these programs are supposed to confer and what's actually coming out of CARB, we found that there are two basic reasons why this is occurring. The first is that CARB might not be collecting the data it needs to be responsive to the intention of the program. That's certainly true of what the state auditor referred to regarding the loan repayment numbers for its financing assistance program. We asked why CARB can't measure the loan repayment in order to justify or to back up its claims about increased credit scores. CARB told us, well, they don't control the loans themselves. So as a result, they don't know whether participants are successfully repaying those loans. We would obviously encourage CARB to do whatever it could to access that information through one of its third-party administrators, or using its authority, or look for remedies to do so in another way, either with the help of the legislature or what have you. But at minimum, we would not expect CARB to design a program and make claims about that program's efficacy that it can't back up with data. On the other hand, there are situations in which CARB has or likely has access to data it could be using to measure and report on these programs, but it just hasn't done so. An example there has to do with its Clean Cars for All program. That program pays folks to scrap old, inefficient vehicles and replace them with newer, used, efficient vehicles, including ZEVs and hybrid vehicles. And part of the assumption of that program is now this individual has a more reliable source of transportation. Now they're going to be able to get to jobs, job interviews. We're going to see a financial benefit to them that goes beyond on the second or third order, beyond just providing them the access to a vehicle itself. CARB recognizes this. We know that because not only does it make the claim that this is the program's intent, but it designed on 14 different occasions when entering into contracts with local air districts, it designed sample survey questions that try to get at these very issues. How has your income changed since you got your new vehicle? How reliable is your new vehicle? How much does it cost you to maintain your new vehicle? Is that more or less than you used to pay? Questions that are very pertinent to the theory behind the program's second and third level benefits. However, when we went to look at that survey data, we found CARB doesn't actually collect it. And not only do they not collect it, but they don't actually require the air districts to ask those specific questions. So CARB doesn't know what questions the air district is actually asking. If it's those questions, if it's some unrelated questions, if it's a mix of questions. So CARB may have a trove of very useful data at its hands, or it may have something that's completely unusable, several years into this project. So to kind of address this range of issues we identified, we put together what we think are a pretty comprehensive set of recommendations in the socioeconomic side. Those include CARB going through and designating which of its programs it expects to provide these benefits that are just go beyond GHG reductions. That's important because it's an important piece of transparency to allow participants and stakeholders in the legislature to know what the expectation is from these programs. But it's also important from an accountability standpoint because these programs can cost significantly more to operate. The financing assistance program costs about 7 times as much to reduce 1 ton of GHGs as something like TVRP. And the reason for that is there's a lot more investment in not just the financial incentives, but also the participants. There's large staffing costs associated with walking participants through the loan process, coaching them on financial literacy. But as I've alluded to already, that's kind of where the investment stops. And we don't know whether those sizable dollar investments are actually paying off like CARB assumes they are. Obviously, then we would like CARB to go through using that diagnosis and make sure that it has measurable metrics with usable data that can be used to report to the legislature and to its board on whether programs are actually working as they assume they do based on the logic models they've created. And finally, to use that information to recommend, as has already been alluded to in this discussion, this program is really working, it's really paying off in terms of the socioeconomic side, it's worth the added investment versus we need to tweak this other program, we need to assess whether or not these types of benefits are actually reasonable to expect from a transportation program, and so forth. So both on the GHG side and on the socioeconomic side, the real end goal of all of our recommendations is to provide greater transparency and a greater tool for the legislature and for CARB to use to pursue the diverse but important goals that California has set forth in its ambitious carbon reduction plans. And so with that, I thank you for the opportunity to present, and we'd be happy to handle any questions you might have.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. With that, I know there's a number of questions from members. What I'm going to do is we'll start with questions here in the room, and then we'll move to remote participation for the members that are participating remotely that have questions. And with that, I guess I'll go ahead and just kick us off, and maybe I'll just ask something that that you guys both talked about earlier. I know Ms. Howell mentioned it, but the 2015 CARB guidelines to track the benefits that you were talking about. What was the reason why CARB did not follow these guidelines that were outlined back in 2015? What did they say as a reason why they didn't do this?
So they provided us 2 reasons, Mr. Salas. One was the technical complexity involved in developing a way to measure job creation as a function of the investments its programs are making. However, we rebut that in our text by saying what they ultimately settled on was a fairly standard and widely used kind of input-output model that has been used in this area for a long time. And so we didn't believe that the technical complexity was really a limiting factor in their ability to roll this out. The other issue that they pointed to is these grant agreements I've alluded to that they enter into with the third parties that administer a lot of these programs in the field. And they had said, well, based on the timing of some of these agreements, we haven't been able to insert requirements into these agreements that compel the administrators to report this information to us. And we pointed out that not only are many of these agreements entered into post 2015, but that among the agreements that we reviewed, CARB has amended those agreements on numerous occasions for things like extending time, extending dollar amounts, and so forth. So we strongly encourage CARB to revisit those arrangements with its administrators and say, hey, we'd like you to perform this relatively low-cost piece of analysis for us so that we can make sure we're fulfilling our obligation to state law, but also to our own funding guidelines. And so we're, anticipating that hopefully CARB will pursue both of those remedies soon.
Got it. Thank you. So to the first point, the technical complexity, you're saying you believe they could have still provided that information. And to the second point, when they amended all their third-party administered contracts, they could have had an amendment in there to actually build in the data that was required under legislation.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, I wanted to ask about one of the incentive programs that you guys talked about in the report. and that's the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, the CVRP program, which is a statewide program that allows consumers to apply for rebates if they purchase battery electric vehicles, hydrogen-fueled electric vehicles, or plug-in hybrid electric, light-duty vehicles, or zero-emission motorcycles. And when I looked at the report, there was nearly $1 billion in cap and trade fund that have been spent on the program. When you looked at that, what percentage was actually spent in disadvantaged communities?
Sure. Thank you for the question. We don't have that number over the life of the program. One reason for that is that the program actually predates the requirement in state law. So it predates the legislation that created DAC, disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. But I can tell you that in recent years, those numbers have been relatively low compared to some of the other programs CARB operates. I believe in 2019, the full year of calendar year 2019, which is the most recent year on which CARB has reported this, CVRP was around 10 or 11% in spending, disadvantaged community spending, whereas some other programs like the truck and bus voucher program were much higher, around 40 or even up to 50%. And then I'd also note that in previous years, CARB was reporting kind of a larger pool of CVRP spending in those disadvantaged communities. However, that was under a previous version of the law and the guidance from Cal EPA that allowed CARB and other agencies to take credit for spending that didn't take place directly inside disadvantaged communities, but rather in adjoining or abutting communities that would, in theory, benefit environmentally from the investment anyway. Notably, the legislature in 2016 came through and said, no, we definitely want to focus the spending in the disadvantaged communities themselves. That's where we want to see the benefits. But in CVRP's case, that seems to have coincided with a pretty marked reduction in the number of dollars being spent in disadvantaged communities.
Got it. Thank you. I know I had my staff pull up some of the numbers, and I know from 2016 in the CVRP, the rebate program, more than 80%, which was $34 million, was spent outside of the disadvantaged communities. And so I just wanted to ask to see if you had looked at that specifically. If not, that we can make sure we're asking CARB when they come up after.
And I would just note, sir, that 80% is actually of their disadvantaged community spending. So they claimed 42 million in disadvantaged community spending, and 80% of that took place outside of the disadvantaged communities themselves. So it's a little even more notable than you had.
Got it. So of the 42 million that they were supposed to spend in a disadvantaged community, 80% of that was spent outside of a disadvantaged community of that pocket of money. That's what
Correct.
You're saying. Got it.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then you had mentioned, and Ms. Howell also talked about it, but the overlap in the programs, was there any metric that CARB provided to adjust for the overlap in the programs that you guys were talked about in the audit report?
No. So, we looked at every program we went to. We went through in detail the regulatory justification documents, and then many of the funding, that's on the regulatory program side. And then on the incentive program side, all of the materials associated with the funding plans where CARB proposes funding for the program, really looking for any acknowledgement or any formal kind of analysis of that overlap, which is very stark in many cases, and did not find it. I will note, and this is important to kind of the conclusions we reach in our audit, is that the reason CARB gave on the regulatory program side was that it wants to develop standards, regulations, and rules that are achievable without the help of incentive programs, because it doesn't know whether incentive programs like CVRP will exist in perpetuity or whether there'll be enough money to account for the entirety of the industry that's being affected. And so we kind of gave CARB the benefit of the doubt and said that's a reasonable approach. What that means, almost by definition, is that the incentive dollars should be creating reductions above and beyond what your regulations would achieve alone. And that's where we really expected to see an analysis from CARB about, okay, we have CVRP, we know we have a ZEV regulation that's supposed to stand on its own in terms of its effectiveness. What else is CVRP bringing to the table in terms of vehicles sold? And there is some indication in statewide data that there are more ZEVs being sold than the regulations currently require, but CARB hasn't done any formal effort to determine whether that's the result of CVRP, whether that's the result of purely consumer preference, whether that's the result of federal programs, et cetera. So they're still pretty much in the dark about the marginal benefit that the incentive programs bring to the table.
Got it. And on that overlap, do you have any recommendations for the legislature so we could create a policy that ensures clear outcomes for those?
So we don't have a legislative recommendation directed at this. We try to avoid being overly prescriptive about the process that CARB should approach this with. I mean, although we were very prescriptive about the types of considerations it should make. Part of that is, this issue may or may not apply, may apply more or less given the specific program, given the specific vehicle. We intentionally looked at programs that we thought had a high risk of overlap or possible duplication or redundancy. And another reason is that CARB has significant work to do to think about how its programs are designed in order to stimulate the greatest activity on the back end, but also to make sure they have metrics that they can be accountable for. That said, if there is a role for legislative oversight or kind of accountability that CARB is doing that, we can certainly be providing any sort of technical assistance that you might need.
Got it. Thank you. I have additional questions, but I'm going to defer to my colleagues in the room for their questions. But I do want to let members know that are participating remotely. If you want to get on the list to ask a question, I believe the quickest and most efficient way is to just text me, and I think my number was provided to each of the members. Text me and I'll get you in queue for a line of questioning. So with that, we're going to move to Assemblymember Friedman, then to Senator Gonzalez, and to Senator Dolly.
Thanks. First, I want to thank the auditor and thank Senator Bradford for bringing this forward. It's crucial that we have good quantitative data to understand these programs and improve them moving forward. I think that should be everybody's goal. And I really appreciate the auditor highlighting some of the deficiencies in the reports. I just have a few quick questions. First of all, another statement. I do think that when it comes to looking at the issue with disadvantaged communities and the sort of underutilization of the incentives, I think it's also really important that we use data to understand that there very well might be barriers beyond the incentive that prevent those communities from taking advantage of the program. Inability to insure a car, inability to store a car, charge a car. There's a lot of things beyond the program itself, some of which could be very well out of CARB's control. And I really like the comment from the auditor about looking at mobility and equity and serving disadvantaged communities in terms of having an eye towards not just saying we want everybody in these communities to purchase a vehicle or be able to, but to say we want everybody in these communities to have very good, convenient mobility options that are provide them better mobility. Mobility needs to be the goal, not any particular type of vehicle. So my question, and one more comment and then my question. The other comment is that some of the questions that you had highlighted as potential questions to ask people in these communities about their financial status before having a car and after, or income, I do think could be seen by some members of that community as being very intrusive questions. So I think that it's not that easy to get participation with that kind of line of questioning for anybody there. They're pretty invasive questions. So my question is that I wonder whether that a lot of these impacts are really beyond CARB's kind of jurisdiction, beyond their ability to really ascertain. And I'm wondering if the auditor has any suggestions of who really should be doing this analysis and who should be looking at this, because listening to you, I wonder whether CARB is the correct body to do evaluation of those kinds of impacts. So that's my first question.
Certainly. So I don't think it's our intention to rule out the assistance or the participation of any other entity. And as we include in our report, CARB is under contract with UC and other entities, and with the aim of attempting to kind of improve some of this data collection. But I think what we keep coming back to, or we kept coming back to in our analysis was, understanding the barriers that you raise about some of the questions or accessing these. The questions you're referencing are of CARB's own design. So it appears that there's an acknowledgement in CARB when they design these programs and that they create a logic model that should be measurable, that they expect to happen, We just haven't seen the level of effort on the back end. So, if we had more of that effort, trial and error to assess, and we knew more about what, in actuality, what the barriers have been to CARB data collection, it would be easier for us to speak to who the right person is if it's not CARB. But unfortunately, that's not kind of a reality we were able to evaluate.
So you don't have any ideas of kind of what the right entity would be to do this kind of analysis or even do the data collection, because it doesn't seem like it's CARB to me.
Well, it's not just CARB. It's CARB's third-party administrators. CARB pays air districts and nonprofit organizations to administer these programs, to interface with participants, to handle a lot of the application processes. And so it may not be CARB on the ground asking these questions, but that would be, that's kind of a natural, inroad into, working with the participants, whoever they may be, collecting data, whatever it may be relevant to the program. But what we haven't seen is appropriate kind of foresight and oversight on CARB to ensure that it's positioning itself to require that data collection, to help its program administrators know what to collect, and certainly to evaluate whether or not it's being collected. So again, I kind of just, for lack of a better phrase, defer to the fact that there do seem to be resources in play, and without having seen evidence of it being unsuccessful given a level of effort, it's hard for us to speculate about who would be a more appropriate resource.
Okay, and I ask because I think it is important that we have better data, and we have the data as we evaluate these programs. And then my last question for now is, what does your office envision as the ideal outcome from this audit? Is it to have CARB spend more time on programmatic, qualifications and evaluations, or is it to eliminate the programs that aren't really directly reducing emissions? I mean, it seems to me that a good point of the audit is that the legislature needs to understand how these programs interact with each other, right? Because no one program is going to kind of be the silver bullet. You have a lot of different programs and a lot of different policy. Can this only be accomplished with the quantification of the impacts of the program, or is it just as important for us to have sort of a better narrative of how all these programs work together and the regulatory side work together?
Yes, thank you. I think the narrative is relatively in place in some case, right? The logic models do, the assumptions are not unreasonable on a program by program basis. It's not, we didn't approach this with any sort of preconceived notions about, whether it does or does not make sense to on the one hand, compel certain types of production and sale, on the other hand, really try to help people bring California past what regulations can realistically achieve on their own. So I do think at this point, it really does come down to being intentional about learning from measuring what programs are actually able to achieve in these myriad different ways and myriad different data sources, and then being intentional about whether those programs are adding the magnitude of benefits that the state would expect. And fundamentally, in terms of an outcome, a product, we would hope that is information for the legislature that joins the narrative with data about, these types of incentive programs provide these types of benefits reliably. Maybe these do not as much. We should invest more in program X and consider revisions to program Y. And I think the problem right now is that the same sort of limitations, data-wise, measurement-wise, reporting-wise, are kind of present across the entire range of incentive programs we reviewed. And so the legislature is forced to take at face value the relative efficacy of those programs, when in fact those measurements don't actually tell the story about how the push and pull with regulations or the influence from outside of CARB's control, whether it be from other state programs or federal programs or what have you.
So just to clarify, it sounds to me like you're saying that really the ultimate goal of the audit in the end of the day is for us to understand that bigger picture of how these programs interact with each other, right? So it's not really to say that any one program's not working. It is to develop that data set that gives us that holistic picture.
Well, we would hope that that data set would test the assumptions about how these programs fit together and give the legislature information about where they're getting bang for their buck, where they're getting return on investment. So the legislature can make informed and reliable decisions about where to put our resources in the pursuit of the goals. So yes, understanding the programs and what they're supposed to accomplish is a key step, but that in and of itself is not going to be sufficient for the legislature to make good investments, reliable investments now. It might only be sufficient to allow us to get to 2030 and then look backwards and say, were our assumptions correct, yes or no? We don't believe that's a sufficient place for the state to kind of wager on.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Friedman. Sounds like to me, the more data you have, you could determine the most bang for the buck is kind of what they're talking about. But with that, we'll move to Senator Gonzalez, and then we'll move to Senator Dolly, then Assemblymember Frazier, then Assemblymember Fong, then Senator Wachowski.
Yes,
Please.
thank you. Thank you, Chair Salas, and thank you very much for this panel. Most of the questions that I've asked actually have been answered, but I just want to drill down on one particular program that you had mentioned, which is the loan repayment increased credit scores goal. And I guess the discussion there was that they don't, from CARB's perspective, is that they don't control the loans. But can you give us more on what recommendations could be put forward in addition to just stating flatly that they can't control the loans? This I think is a big factor in obviously this program as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, possibly my initial remarks kind of show that we weren't fully convinced by the lack of owning the loan as a true limiting factor, and understanding what's been raised about the potential invasiveness of questions. We would encourage CARB to do what it can to work with its program administrators to say, are you successfully repaying your loan? The CARB alternatively identified the frequency of repossessions of vehicles as another potential tool they could use, but that's not something they've looked at formally. When we raised that with them, they kind of went and looked to see what had happened and said, oh, it's a small program thus far, so we haven't really utilized this data to try and extrapolate about how effective the program is. Our counter to that was, well, it's a pilot program, so it's kind of relatively small by its nature, and what better time to be taking advantage of the program's relative size to be creative about how you're going to close the gap between where you are now and what you think the program is supposed to provide to its participants in terms of increased credit scores. So we're not opposed to using a reasonable stand-in or proxy for credit scores, but CARB is kind of well short of that. And the last thing I'll say about this program, since you've expressed interest, is our review of the program data that CARB does collect suggests that there's pretty wide variation in the loan interest rates that the program is involved in. So these are not necessarily loans achieved through the program directly, but we saw loans as high, upwards of 25% on some of these vehicle acquisitions. And so again, trying to divorce it from what's directly inside and outside of CARB's control, what we do feel like is in their control is to be very proactive and responsive to what they're seeing in the data to say, is that a loan that we want associated with our program? Is that a loan that provides the participant with the type of opportunity that this program is intended to provide? And if not, then we need to see interventions, and we need to see them at the pilot program stage before there is a decision made to expand this program larger or alternatively not to pursue it. So I hope I answered your question. If not, I'm happy to try again.
You did. And I just want to say thank you. And that's exactly what I wanted to, the point I guess I'm trying to make as well, is that, there's so many other issues that could have happened because of lack of oversight, which is these high interest rates, which puts people deeper into debt and in a much more difficult situation than they need to be. So I appreciate that. And so I'll leave it there. But what I will say is I'm just sort of taken aback by the lack of data collection, this loan repayment program that should benefit people, and then the consumer behavior trends should be a goal, as you mentioned. We need that data to be able to assume that this is working or not, and be able to adjust policies from there on. So thank you very much for answering that question.
All right. Thank you, Senator Gonzalez. And I know Senator Bradford has a lot of concerns when he initially talked to me about the audit, about the socioeconomic benefits that CARB is claiming. So thank you for asking that question on behalf of Senator Bradford as well. Let's move to Senator Dolly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I wanted to just first off thank Senator Laird for his opening comments. It's been 12 years since 2008 when they passed AB 32, and I don't know if there's, maybe you're the only member sitting that actually was here then that when it happened. I'm not sure. But in the auditor's report, and since then we have seven, as of October last year, there were 700,000 ZEVs sold in California. The auditor's report noted all the state's ZEV goals have been established through executive order. First, Governor Brown with 1.5 million by 2025, and then 5 million by 2030. And Governor Newsom's executive order directed the ARB to achieve 100% ZEV sales by 2035, which is 14 years from now. So at the rate we went in the past and the rate we're going, my question is, number one, what statutory authority will be relied on to adopt regulation to ban the sales of internal combustion engine by 2035 as directed by Governor Newsom's executive order?
So I can say that executive order wasn't a primary focus of the audit. However, I would defer to, we have legal counsel here. Heather, I don't know if that's something you can speak to or not. It wasn't a direct focus.
That wasn't a direct focus of our audit. Insofar as what kind of statutory authority, the legislature can pass what it wants to as long as it's not in conflict with federal law.
That's my point, is that the legislature hasn't passed, these have been done by executive order, so that was my question actually.
And Senator, it might be prudent upon us, we'll ask CARB that question when they come up, since they'll be the implementing body.
Okay, that's my only question for right now then.
Okay, thank you, Senator. With that, we'll move to Assemblymember Frazier, then Assemblymember Fong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is kind of reminiscent of my role as the chair of transportation before for almost 6 years, and before that the chair of accountability and administrative review, which I had my first CARB hearing in the district 8 years ago. And when I became the chair of transportation, we were made aware of the 50+ transportation programs that were administered by CARB. And we did have hearings to ascertain what their metrics of performance was. And after having to have, I believe it was 3 subsequent hearings to get the information, the same kind of results just came out of this audit. It's like deja vu. And one of the things that we've asked them in the, what was the objective of the program? Did you accomplish the goals of the program? How much did it cost? And what was the metric tonnage that was reduced? Nobody had any kind of data whatsoever to tell us. And we would have thought that through that process with the transportation committee that would have evolved. But it seems to come forward that there's this kind of viewpoint that, we'll just poo-poo you and we'll do what we want to do. And, one of the things that if you look at the monies that have been spent since cap and trade has been involved, 25% of cap and trade goes to high-speed rail. Another 25% of cap and trade goes to transit. We have gone through a huge recession from 2008 and recovered late 2012 and on. We just had a huge pandemic. But there was never any relief for goals or anything through industry. So when you look at the economic impacts that were involved on people for regulation to comply, there was no compassion whatsoever. There was only one goal, and you had to comply no matter what. I've seen businesses completely devastated because of the truck and bus rule. People later on in life that don't want to reinvest hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment so that they can finish out the last 2 or 3 years of their, working life. I am so happy that we were finally, I think this is the first audit of this agency. And I'm happy, and I can't thank the state auditor enough for making this effort, who is also a fantastic umpire through the joint baseball, softball. But Mr. Chair, one of the things that this was clearly outlined in the transportation hearings is this exact example of what was clearly brought forward in the audit. We have a role as a body to provide oversight for the money that is spent. When you look since cap and trade has been installed in 2013, I think the investment was starting to be made. $12.5 billion have been invested to reduce, I think, approximately 45 million metric tons of carbon, which is very, very laudable. I'm very proud of them. But in their scoping plan, they don't identify natural carbon emission. And so that 45 million metric tons and $12.5 billion that was spent was negated by the 2018 wildfires in California. You want to talk about disadvantaged communities? Everything in California was a disadvantaged community with all of that smoke. 68 million metric tons in 2018 alone, negating 7 years of investment. 7 years. We need to be able to make sure that we have the biggest bang for our buck in investment. Tailpipe emissions are important, but if you keep throwing bad money after good, and then we have these natural occurring wildfires in Santa Cruz and all of these areas that are devastated, we are not making any accomplishments whatsoever. Take 2 steps forward and 5 back. 200 million metric tons have been emitted in 3 years of wildfires. We need to reprioritize to be able to catch up on the largest carbon emitter and be able to come back and say, okay, we've got a handle on this now. We need to be able to work towards that. Mr. Chair, I appreciate your letting me speak my piece.
Thank you, Assemblymember Frazier, and I think you just highlight some of the frustrations that members have. I know you said you've had a number of hearings on CARB and still seeing the lack of data, I think, is what the audit report is kind of alluded to, so that we can make more informed decisions. With that, we'll move to Assemblymember Fong.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to build off of some questions that the Assembly Transportation Chair mentioned about whether CARB is the right entity to evaluate its programs. And I've heard from, I guess, reading the audit report, there's some programs that that indicate that CARB can collect the data and it doesn't. And then there are some programs that indicate that CARB just doesn't have the capability to collect the data right now. And so it kind of covers that spectrum. So I guess from my understanding, and of course, what the transportation chair from the Senate has said is that we're evaluating in the budget billions of dollars that are going to be going to these programs, but we can't, as a legislature, evaluate whether things are working or not. And you've got programs that CARB is saying works, but there's no evidence to back it up, and then there are programs that don't have any data whatsoever. So how do I juxtapose that reality with the timeliness of the fact that we're making decisions right now? So how do I evaluate those recommendations where you're asking for an annual report, but we're making decisions now?
I certainly sympathize with the challenge there, and I can only say in terms of the timing of our report, our recommendations, that those are in part a function of kind of the lack of a strong foundation for many of the programs. And I just want to back up slightly to clarify that I think, there is a spectrum of level of difficulty, potential level of effort to some of this data, but I don't know that we identified or reported on many that are squarely within the CARB cannot access this. CARB has no way of obtaining this. If for no other reason, then CARB has not demonstrated the effort, a formal effort to do so. So that that lack of data collection, that lack of program design or systems built into place to be iterative and to be responsive to data when it comes in, whether it be behavioral data, whether it be data about the number of vehicles being sold in California through compared to regulations as opposed to the credit system that's currently being used. Those will take some time for CARB to put in place and to test their assumptions. We've identified, I think, in the report where there's low-hanging fruit, and we would expect CARB to be judicious and pragmatic about getting after that stuff first and foremost, and potentially making large conclusions from that data collection. If they were to enhance their survey efforts significantly, then you could test some basic assumptions, at least on the socioeconomic side, potentially very quickly. But unfortunately, yes, there's going to have to be an iterative process, and it's a complex process, and we acknowledge that. So I think, to answer your question as best as I can, I think that the challenge there is, the legacy of the time lag between when some of these programs have gone in place, the money that's been spent on them, and where we find ourselves now. So there's a little bit, there's a situation of missed opportunity with respect to that, and that was certainly, frustrating to us as a team. But we've tried to be strategic and be direct about where CARB should go in order to rectify that going forward.
So I appreciate that perspective. I guess I'm going to channel my frustrations, I think, through what was said through the former transportation chair of the Assembly, that you would think that these things would have been put into motion a decade ago, and now we're over a decade in, and we still don't know, or we may not have the ability to know whether these programs are even effective or not. And then at the same time, the very agency that is now going to come before us as a legislature is asking for more money, telling us that these programs are working when we don't know if they're working or not. So I think that's the big challenge we have as through this audit and as through the transportation committees and through the budget process is, trying to get CARB to give us real-time information, which is critical, and with at the same time also understanding that they may not be very objective in terms of whether their programs are working or not. I've never had an agency testify before us that said their programs aren't working. They just say that they're not working and they need more money for it. And when you've indicated that the fact that the objectives and of the programs are not aligned with the goals and the reports, that's very disconcerting for someone like myself, and I'm sure other members of the legislature who pride themselves on trying to hold agencies accountable. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Assemblymember Fogg. And I know you serve on the Budget Committee, but maybe you might be prudent to ask CARB if they want to defer some of their budget to this data collection from the third-party providers.
Well, and this may be, to the chair, it may be something where, sub 6 may have to go do some program evaluation as well.
Got it. With that, we're going to move to our remote participation. Senator Wachowski, if we could get Senator Wachowski on. Okay, we'll come back to Senator Wachowski. Let's move to Assemblymember Gibson.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed, Mr.
Okay,
Gibson.
thank you very much. Don't know if this question was already asked, but let me ask it, and I just rely on you just to tell me if this question has been asked already. According to the auditor's report, page 32, I want to call to your attention page 32, 32 through 33. You previously reported to the Budget Committee that you would need to pay $2.1 million rebate, totaling $5.6 billion to get 5 million ZEB on the road to meet the governor's executive orders. How did you determine that you would need to spend $5 billion in public funding to achieve the governor's targeted target without collecting the evaluation, the relevant data needing that was noted in the auditor's report. Does that make sense? Did you understand the question?
Yes, sir. But I just wanted to clarify that I'm speaking on behalf of the auditor, so I can certainly speak to that issue, but I couldn't provide CARB's perspective. But I'm happy to talk about that issue in the report if you'd like me to.
Would you please?
Yes, sir. So the way CARB obtained that number is that the question from the legislature was a very pertinent one, which was, we have this goal. It's really the question we've been asking, in a sense, is what will it take resource-wise to get us to that goal? And what we would have expected CARB to have in response was to know, well, if we make an investment on the front end, here's what we know we'll get out in terms of vehicles on the back end. But instead, because CARB hasn't conducted the types of data analysis that we've been discussing today, what CARB did was the inverse of that. They just assumed, a scenario in which 5 million vehicles would be sold, and then used historical data to say, well, we on average pay for about 1 out of 2 ZEVs that are sold in California through CVRP. Therefore, we'll just do the math. And so that, to us, is a budgeting exercise. It's not an exercise in trying to accomplish what the program is set up to do, which is to invest money up front to get a return on the sufficiency of that vehicle market going forward.
Okay. So what, in your opinion, what do you think is going to take of taxpayers' money in order to reach your goal, to reach the governor's goal?
So I'm afraid I cannot speak to that now. If CARB were to have information about how effective a given rebate is at, better information about, on average, what does a rebate get you in terms of not just real GHG emissions, but also in terms of market response, in terms of how do we invest now to drive prices down? How do we know when we've made sufficient investments that incentives may no longer be necessary? If they had done the research to know are incentive amounts the most effective they could be, then we might be able to run those numbers for you, sir. But right now, CARB did what all that anybody could given its lack of data, which is to say, well, we'll just reverse the question kind of on its ear and respond back about, given historical trends, what this would look like in budget terms.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'll ask another question, but yeah, I'm good for right now.
All right. Thank you, Assemblymember Gibson, and perhaps we can circle back to those questionings of CARB when we bring up the next panel.
Yeah.
With that, we're going to move to, let me ask if Senator Wachowski is on the line. If not, then we will move to Senator Becker.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to confirm here, because the headlines were quite dramatic. Just nothing here shows that CARB's programs are poor, correct? We are not talking about an EDD situation with significant waste. It seems like the main finding is that CARB isn't collecting as much data as they should to verify all the intended benefits and possibly could be optimizing the use of funds better. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. It's correct in the sense that we don't currently have sufficient data to make informed determinations about the relative benefits of programs or how effective they are compared to other potential uses of the money. And for that reason, we don't have anywhere in our report recommendations about programs that should go away, programs that should be expanded. We certainly would look to make those types of recommendations were the data more available. So our conclusion here is that we don't know. We have reason to believe that there's somewhere on the spectrum between 100% effective and not effective at all. But the evidence really isn't there to show us where in that continuum a given program would land, which of course inhibits the state's ability to pick the winners and potentially reconsider the losers.
That's great. Yes, and I'm all for data and certainly legitimate questions to ask about relative bang for the buck. But I just wanted that kind of on the record that we're not saying CARB's doing a bad job. We're just looking for access to more data and to make sure that they're optimizing as well as possible. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Senator. We're going to thank you. I think this concludes who I have on the list to ask questions of the state auditor, unless Senator Wachowski is on. If not, I will thank the auditor and her team. Mr. Reinardi, thank you for your presentation on the overview of the audit of the California Air Resources Board. And with that, let me ask one more time if Senator Wachowski is on. Okay, if not, we're going to go ahead and move to agenda item number 3, comments and response for the California Air Resources Board. We have Richard Corey, the Executive Officer, Jennifer Gress, Chief Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division, Sydney Burgess, Chief Mobile Source Control Division. And let's go ahead and begin with the next panel, please. Mr. Corey.
Yes, thanks, Chair. And I have been having some connectivity issues, so Dr. Burgess will back me up if I drop off during my remarks. But thank you very much to you and the members, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. I also want to thank the state auditor and her team for their work on the audit over the past year, and acknowledge the auditor's findings and our commitment to make improvements, which I'll be discussing in a moment. But first, I'd like to start by discussing CARB's track record in reducing emissions and improving air quality. Over the last couple decades, we've seen ozone in the South Coast substantially decrease, and significantly more of the region is now meeting federal air quality standards for ozone. This occurred while the number of vehicles, miles traveled, driven, population, and economy continue to grow dramatically. Similarly, we're seeing much less particulate matter in the San Joaquin Valley. By collaborating with the Air District on a recent state implementation plan to accelerate reductions from agricultural equipment, trucks, buses, residential wood burning, we've seen lower PM 2.5 levels across the valley. We've also seen tremendous reductions in our toxic exposure from diesel particulate matter, heavy metals, and toxic VOCs over the past decades. For example, since 1990, the cancer risk associated with diesel PM has decreased by over 70%, while diesel vehicle miles traveled increased 80%. Finally, the result of California's greenhouse gas programs is clear as California achieved its 2020 GHG target, the one spoke about earlier a short while ago, by 4 years ahead of schedule. However, we recognize much more needs to be done to meet our climate and air quality goals, as 90% of Californians, as the chair mentioned, still breathe unhealthy air. We agree that this is unacceptable, and we're implementing measures that support the transition to zero-emission mobile and other sources at an unprecedented scale and scope. In spite of the tremendous progress, I will note that we have the most challenging air quality problems in the country and some of the most ambitious GHG reduction targets. And as has been the case for decades, federal and state law requires multiple strategies that work together. The audit report notes that CARB overestimates greenhouse gas emission reductions that individual transportation programs achieve. And the auditor made a number of findings focused on the interaction between regulations and incentives targeting the same emission sources, with recommendations to better isolate the benefits of each. No doubt, more data as well as further analysis of data that is collected will be important and useful. But there's some nuance around this issue, so some background may be helpful. As part of our control strategy and per legislative direction, we apply multiple complementary strategies, some regulatory and others incentive-based, designed to work together to collectively reduce emissions. As an example is the state's ZEV strategy that was discussed. The state's ZEV regulation requires ZEV manufacturers to produce these vehicles for sale. There are also incentives such as CVRP, the federal tax credit, the carpool lane access to encourage Californians to buy and drive ZEVs, and public infrastructure investments to ensure the vehicles can be conveniently charged. Remove any one of these pieces and would hamper early deployment of ZEVs. As noted, we have half the ZEVs in the United States, a ZEV manufacturer, in fact, several manufacturers of zero-emission vehicles all the way up to trucks coming to California, manufacturing coming to California. The LA Economic Development Corporation will say on record, that's because of the state's policies here. While this complementary policy approach is generally accepted as a needed approach for transforming the transportation sector to zero emissions, it's challenging to accurately attribute benefits to each individual component of the strategy, as has been discussed for the last hour. To help explain how difficult this is, imagine you're surveying a consumer who recently purchased a ZEV. Did they purchase it because of CVRP? Because the vehicle was due to the ZEV regulation? Because of access to an HOV lane sticker? The federal tax credit, recent investments in infrastructure in their neighborhood, EV public awareness campaigns, or perhaps all the above? Consumer behavior is a tricky thing to nail down. So if you survey someone and ask, why'd you purchase that ZEV? It's likely a combination of those things. And they'll not respond with a clean cut response. 20% of my decision was CVRP, 10% was federal tax credit, and so on. That's the challenge. This isn't how consumers generally operate, and further academic literature has demonstrated that frequently consumers are generally unable to quantify choices at this level. Of course, this doesn't mean we don't do our best to figure out the right methodology and the approach to measuring programmatic impacts, nor does it mean we cannot do more. We can and we will. But in the case of incentives and consumer choice, I just wanted to emphasize the challenges that are present. We're committed to doing our best to implement the auditor's recommendations. Some may take some time and some resources. But before I move on, I want to note that our emission inventory does account for the complementary policies and avoids overcounting of emissions benefits to accurately estimate emissions in California. Emissions of criteria pollutants, emissions of GHGs. The emission inventory accurately quantifies the amount of fossil fuel used in the transportation sector and the resulting emissions, regardless which policies led to the displacement of fossil fuel vehicles with ZEVs. The emission inventory has a critical role in both tracking our progress towards our emission reduction goals and identifying where we need to pursue additional reductions. In short, the emission reductions we're seeing in our air quality and our climate program for decades are real and borne out by federal, or rather fuel consumption and air quality data. Having addressed these general issues, I'll now turn to the additional audit findings and recommendations, specifically the finding that there are areas where additional data collection and analysis would help CARB more strategically implement its incentive programs. We agree. Having more data is also beneficial as a further analysis of the data that is collected when designing, implementing, and evaluating California's emission control strategies. And we already started addressing the auditor's recommendations and are committed to do more in the next year to further address them. It'll take more time some time to work through the public process, determine the most efficient and effective mechanisms to collect and analyze the additional data and information, and we're committed to do it. Implementing a number of the recommendations will likely come with an assessment that additional staffing and resources will be necessary to avoid directing resources away from regulatory efforts to further reduce toxic air pollutants from trucks, ships, freight-related sources. In regard to the auditor's finding regarding socioeconomic benefits for California's or CARB's equity programs, that while we agree that we should improve our data collection process to better quantify important benefits, these programs remain critical for equity purposes while pursuing their climate goals. CARB's equity programs are developed and modified through an annual public process, which involves input from stakeholders, particularly equity stakeholders that we reach out to and inform the methods, as well as guided by legislative direction. For example, the Charge Ahead initiative passed in 2014 by former Pro Tem Senator De Leon and Clean Cars for All statute by Assembly Member Cooper. For the equity programs, more than any others, the voices of those equity groups and communities that stand to benefit from the program must be central to program design. To date, many of the socioeconomic benefits assessed have been qualitative, as noted. These include benefits such as more reliable access to clean transportation for low-income individuals, improved financial circumstances, tractor replacements in the Central Valley, cleaner trucks in our most impacted environmental justice communities. However, CARB acknowledges the auditor's finding that quantification of socioeconomic benefits across equity programs would provide useful information to determine programmatic success and areas for refinement. We'll work through our public process to make sure that we do so in a way that is supportive of the groups these incentives serve. Additionally, the auditor fulfilled her charge and looked at the programs through the lens of GHGs. I must also note that the transportation sector is our largest source of GHGs, pollutants that form ozone and toxic pollutants. Thus, most of our measures are designed to reduce emissions of ozone-forming and toxic pollutants as well as GHGs, focusing on a triple play, thus understating the benefits when simply looked at through a GHG perspective. No doubt, meeting our healthy air quality and climate targets will require us to push harder on this sector, and we will. We agree that with the auditor, that reducing GHG emissions from this sector is important, and more will need to be done to drive down emissions to meet both the 2030 and beyond targets. We'll also examine every opportunity to achieve these goals, including driving down emissions from the state's largest stationary sources, such as refineries and natural gas emitters, as they are a key source of pollutants at the community level, which contribute to ozone and toxic pollutants. We're committed to do so as we update the state's scoping plan in the next few months. It will be launched. CARB looks forward to working with the auditor to implement its recommendations related to the data collection and reporting. Here with me today are two division chiefs from CARB who oversee a number of the programs discussed in the audit. Sydney Burgess, who oversees the Mobile Source Control Division, and Jennifer Gress, who oversees the Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division. And with that, Chair, I conclude my remarks.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Corey. And I know we have a number of questions from members, and appreciate your opening comments. And we're going to go ahead and just move into questionings. We'll start with members here in the room, and I'm going to defer to Senator Bradford, who was chairing another committee and now has joined us. So, Senator Bradford.
Thank you, Chair Salas, and I want to thank this committee for your courageous leadership, the Joint Legislative Audit Committee for approving my request last year to audit CARB. As we all now know, this audit was not only necessary, but long overdue. When I read the report, I have to admit, I wasn't shocked, but only amazed that it was worse than we could have ever envisioned. Because of this communities I say that I represent, I'm familiar with the failure of the CARB programs to translate the state policies into real results on the ground. But this audit reveals something even more problematic, which is the lack of accountability, responsiveness, and respect of this legislature. It is bad enough for the policies and programs to be prioritized over people. To hear the report by Mr. Curry, as the report's audit stated, it's indefensible and almost insulting. There are many issues that we need to discuss today, and I welcome the conversation, but I have to get to another committee, but I just want to run to something real quick. And I want to thank Mr. Curry for being here today, but I would like to start with how CARB evaluates its socio-economic achievements of its programs. CARB states in response to this audit that you use surveys, focus groups, and other data to evaluate program equity. CARB also stated that staff will evaluate whether to modify future grant solicitations to adjust more matrix. However, this audit found CARB does not consistently collect data to determine whether its equity programs actually provide socioeconomic benefits as intended. Another example, CARB's financing assistance program intends to help low-income consumers finance clean vehicles and increase their credit scores. Yet in 5 years, this program by CARB has not collected not one centella of data that will allow it to report on the benefits that they claim they achieved. CARB cited participants' loan repayment rates as a measure of success. Yet the audit found CARB does not collect data on those rates and does not even have access to the loan data. This is a clear example of CARB using, and I'm going to change it, pimping low-income communities as poster childs for their policies without following through to deliver on the results that are promised to these communities. In fact, the audit describes CARB's evaluation of socioeconomic benefits in this program, again, as disingenuous at best. Given that, why should this legislature take CARB seriously when you state you will be responsive to the audit findings? Frankly, I think your track record gives us cause for alarm that we all should be concerned with. Even state law requires you to, on your cap and trade program, to design a program that provides results in job creations and that those jobs should be tracked. This is state law. But 3 years later, in 2018, CARB updated guidelines specified job creation and training should focus on disadvantaged and low-income communities. However, despite all this time and supposed work that was done, the audit found CARB has failed to do so in a timely and comprehensive way. This audit reviewed 9 programs with job reporting requirements, and only 3 had any job data at all. 2 others had data collected but not reported. This reflects a fundamental failure to deliver on these important equity goals that CARB itself identifies as important. In light of all of this and all the audit findings, I think we have to seriously reconsider the responsibilities and authority the state has given CARB until you can actually meet the statutory and programmatic goals. The failures in this audit to go beyond simply missing data or ineffective, the failures in this audit go beyond simply missing data or ineffective analysis. This audit reveals a fundamental failure of to be accountable not only to the public, but to this legislative body and to your own goals and objectives. Our climate goals are ambitious and demand better use of all if we want to achieve them. This is especially true for CARB, given its power and its failure to live up to its powers over the last 2 decades.
All right. Thank you, Senator Bradford. I didn't hear a specific question in there, but definitely made your point with how you feel about the audit findings.
My question is, what have you done with the billions of dollars? Because you can't show anything for it, but continue to waste constituents' money.
Mr. Corey, please.
Every dollar the legislature has appropriated, whether it be for zero-emission vehicles, zero-emission trucks, lower-emission cleaner tractors, is accounted for, documented, public solicitation goes out and reported. Those programs have led to equipment purchases that are operating in low-income and disadvantaged communities, diesel trucks to zero-emission trucks, lower-emission tractors that are reducing PM 2.5 in the valley, cleaner equipment that's operating in our most impacted ports, rail yards, and warehouses. Every piece of equipment, every recipient of those dollars that are appropriated by the legislature are documented, accounted for, and reported on per appropriation and per guidance that is subject to public review, methods that we go through to document how we're going to track, how we're going to report the solicitation, which is ultimately acted on by our board at a public hearing. So well documented, well reported, that I'd be happy to sit down with any legislator or your staff and go through all the specifics over every one of those dollars that have been appropriated.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Corey. Senator, thank you.
I'm not going to go back and forth. The audit clearly doesn't support a single thing that he just said. None of this has been documented as clearly stated in the audit.
All right, we'll move on. I actually have a question, if we may, Mr. Corey. I know in 2019, you said you sit down with legislators, and we did that, and you've given me information. I know the information that CARB provided to my office showed the distribution of the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program by local air districts. And so what that data showed is Air districts like those in the Bay Area received, a majority of the funding. When I looked at the data, it was nearly $229 million that went to the Bay Area. I compared that just to some areas in the Central Valley, and Kern received only $411,150, which is about 0.06% of the funds. And Imperial County actually received even less, only $131,800 in rebates. So what this tells me is that those living in areas with better air quality are receiving much more funding to improve their air quality, while areas with high pollution levels are seemingly given less attention and funding. So, I asked the auditor earlier, why was 80% of the CVRP funds that were designated for disadvantaged communities spent outside of those disadvantaged communities? If you could help us understand why that's the case, I think the committee would appreciate that.
Yeah, the CVRP program is one, legislatively appropriated. Two is a consumer program, basically to support leases or sale, which is a first come, first served program. It's available to the entire state per legislative direction and a number of laws that have been passed that define its operation. There's also a low income element of CVRP, which if you look overall CVRP and say, well, how much has gone to disadvantaged communities and low income? Disadvantaged and low income together is more like 25%. But if I play out your question, I think it's an important question about looking at CVRP and related programs. Farmer, which is cleaner tractors generally, 80% of that actually goes into the valley to reduce diesel PM and other toxic pollutants. Heavy duty programs for heavy duty trucks, over 70% of those end up operating in disadvantaged communities. So it does vary by program. It varies by the way the basic design. But if you look at trucks, you look at tractors, dominating lower income and disadvantaged communities. In CVRP, both look at DAX and low income, it's about 25%.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Corey. Would you just agree with the notion that every older vehicle we take off the road would help improve and make California reach its climate goals faster?
I would. In fact, I would add to that and say the Clean Cars for All program, which basically is directed at lower income folks. They bring an older, dirtier vehicle and receive and this is also state appropriated, legislative appropriated funding to get a much cleaner vehicle. The vehicles they're replacing are over 20 years old. On average, they're getting a vehicle that's about 4 years or newer and far, far cleaner. In fact, the highest selling vehicles for Clean Cars for All, directed at lower income folks, are plug-ins or hybrid vehicles and even electric vehicles. So your point is well taken. It takes the oldest, dirtier vehicle off the road and gets lower income people in a newer, better performing vehicle that saves them fuel.
Got it. And so I would imagine then, Mr. Corey, that CARB would believe that the CVRP program helps California reach its climate goals. That's a correct assumption, I'm assuming, based off your answer?
That is okay. Assumption. That's correct.
So then I just want to ask, because I was talking with our budget committee and the chairman and the committee members, and I'm just wondering if CARB is going to be pushing for an allocation of funds for the CVRP program, because in the governor's initial budget, it's eliminated. And so from CARB's perspective, trying to meet our climate goals, will you be pushing to reinstate that money into the budget on behalf of the administration?
That would be, of course, as you know, the administration in consultation with the legislature that's subject to a specific appropriation, and that'll play out in the budget process. But what I would say is we know we need more electric vehicles. And let me be really clear on this, because I think the message was muted during the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Not only do we need electric vehicles to transition to reduce GHG emissions, we can't get to our health-based air quality standards, the standards you talked about in the Valley and South Coast, without transforming the transportation. You do the analysis, it can't happen. And no doubt, I've talked about the fact we have half of the country's EVs, and we have the major, the major EV manufacturer in California. We have zero emission forklifts and zero emission buses and transit buses manufacturers coming to California. But the point that the auditor made, I'd be completely agreement. We need more. We need to do it faster.
Got it. I appreciate that. And, obviously it's a level of frustration for some of the members that represent some of the higher pollution air districts. And when we're looking at the funds, especially when you look at nearly 229 million going to the Bay Area and 0.06% going to places like Kern County with $411,000, it doesn't seem that ARB is prioritizing those non-attainment areas to receive some of this funding to help offset and help California meet its goals. Because if California were to adopt the governor's budget the way it is without the CVRP program, it's a $4,500 rebate. What happens to all those low-income customers if they can't partake in the CVRP program?
Hi, this is Jennifer Gress of the California Air Resources Board. It looks like Richard's internet connectivity has broken out. Let me, Dr. Burgess, did you want to talk about CVRP?
So I'll just thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for the opportunity to be here, and for letting me pitch it for Mr. Corey. So I'll just add that CVRP exists alongside a number of other equity programs, including Clean Cars for All, which we've discussed today. That's resulted in 11,000 cars scrapped and replaced on the road, and that funding goes to low-income households and priority communities. The Financing Assistance Program, which has also been discussed, has benefited 2,800 low-income consumers, and I do want to take the opportunity to correct something I heard earlier, which has to do with the interest rates. Interest rates in this program are capped at 8 to 12%, and the average consumer receives a rate of about 5.6%.
Got it. Thank you. I don't think that addressed what happens to low-income customers if they don't receive the CVRP rebate. I'd imagine then they'd be priced out. And then again, I know Mr. Corey said, it's on a first-come, first-served basis, but that doesn't seem to be in alignment with trying to get the most amount of reductions or bang for our buck that the auditor talked about in some of these high attainment areas. So I don't know if you have a comment on that. All right, would anyone like to address that?
Hey, Chairman, this is Mr. Corey. Richard, I just rejoined you. My signal was interrupted. So if one of my colleagues heard your question, if they could respond.
So my understanding of the question is that it's related to opportunities for low-income participants to participate and receive a cleaner vehicle, if not through the CVRP program. One additional piece of information that I think might be helpful and is relevant here, which is the Clean Fuel Reward Program, which is an opportunity that comes from our LCFS programs. Utilities across the state have come together to offer $1,500 on the hood for consumers looking to purchase a new vehicle. So that is also another avenue for folks who are looking to purchase a clean new vehicle, in addition to financing assistance in the Clean Cars for All program.
Got it. And with those additional programs, because the auditor had mentioned overlap, are we still gearing these programs towards these disadvantaged communities, or at least these communities that are definitely in high attainment, polluted areas of the state?
We are, and let me speak specifically, Chair, to that question. So thinking about a few questions. One, the Clean Cars for All program that Dr. Burgess just mentioned, directed at getting lower income folks. They have older, dirty vehicles that they replace. We get a twofer in terms of taking an older, dirty vehicle off the road and getting them in a cleaner vehicle. They're in low income communities. The point that we made about farmer, 80% of farmer is directed at the Valley to get into cleaner tractors and other equipment. Also, the Valley, as you well know, substantial lower income community of color. The heavy duty focus on cleaner trucks. Those clean trucks predominantly operate in disadvantaged communities. I think it's over 70%. So those reductions of diesel PM, which disproportionately impact those communities near warehouses, rail yards, and ports, receive a disproportionate benefit from those programs and those reductions.
Got it. All right. Thank you, Mr. Corey. I do have additional questions, but they're related to questions that other members already brought up. And let me just defer to those members to re-ask their questions. Senator Dowley, I know you had a question earlier that I believe was more directed towards this panel. Yeah, I got you.
First off, I'd just like to make a comment. I'm somebody I'm a farmer, by the way, and we have the Carl Moyle program, which has been around for years, very successful. I agree with you. But I just want to make a comment first. The valley, where Mr. Salas represents, is in a basin where if you took every single person out of the county, Kern County, you would still have pollution there because it's transported. So I just want to make that clear, and that's transported from the westerly winds that come from the coast. And we just saw in the comments that the chair made about how much money spent making sure that Bay Area folks drive a Tesla and get in the carpool lane at the expense of trying to figure out how we get really disadvantaged people in ZEVs. And you're right, they're the twofer. If you get them out of the bad car and you get them into a car that is more affordable, it's great, but there's charging systems that need to be available. There's those things. But I want to get to my main point. My main point is, I asked it earlier, was as the auditor's report noted, all the state's ZEV goals have been established by executive order. The first order was with Governor Brown, 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2025 and 5 million by 2030. Governor Newsom's executive order directs the ARB to achieve 100% zero-emission vehicles by 2035. Senator Laird corrected me. AB 32 was passed in 2006. 14 years. 15 years. Well, it's 14 years till 2035. First of all, the first question is, what statutory authority will you be relying on to adopt regulations to ban the sales of internal combustion engines by 2035 as directed in Governor Newsom's executive order? That's the first question.
Yeah, let me go right at that. What we will be doing is building on the ZEV regulation. So the ZEV regulation is a manufacturer requirement for production. It's not a ban of the use and operation of any in-use IC engine. But to your question on authority, AB 32, state law, Federal Clean Air Act, we can't get to the health-based air quality standards that you touched on in the Valley without transitioning to cleaner transportation. So those laws that focus on ozone, PM 2.5, toxics, and GHGs all have a bearing on supporting a transition to clean transportation. Those are the work that we're doing, both through regulations and incentives, because as you all have noted, we need far more clean trucks and cars than we have today.
Okay, now I want to make another comment, which you heard earlier. You weren't on, I guess, but you heard earlier. So I represent the 1st Senate District, which is Tahoe, the Oregon border, all the way down to Sacramento, which is mostly forested in our watersheds, which has been spewing out carbon. We had 4.2 million acres last year burned in California, and many millions the years past. Since 2012, we've had biggest fires in the state's history, and more devastation in homes and impacted in deaths, which we don't even count in our carbon output to meet these goals. So I know that's not your department. I'm running a bill that will require you to count that. Hopefully it'll get passed and signed into law. The last question I have, which is something I hope you can answer, after reading this audit report, and there's many more things I could talk about that is just very frustrating. I think Senator Bradford did a very good job of articulating the frustration that is happening here in the legislature. But to meet those 2035 goals, How are you going to do it? We got to have something better than what this audit report says. If we're not going to have the ability to buy a zero-emission vehicle, because the manufacturers won't have a new one, I should say, and we're going to rely on, assuming that combustible engines will wear out at some point, and we'll be forced to buy a zero-emission vehicle in California. How are you going to meet that goal?
Right. So, first element of your question, recognizing the magnitude of the challenge, it's significant. There's just no doubt about that. You're not going to get a sugar coat. It's easy. But you will get the fact that the current purchases today of new vehicles that are zero, about 8%, and the number of models and vehicles and affordability and range, and the fact that we're producing vehicles in the state and putting in charging stations, the ramp up, the increase is unprecedented. Both the production, manufacturing that we're seeing in the state and the number of vehicles. So regulation, incentive, partnering with other states, partnering with the manufacturers, support for continued infrastructure investments in California, both state and federal dollars, consumer work, consumer education. Every one of those elements are going to be necessary for this transition, and it's fundamental, not just to GHGs. And I really want to underscore this point because I think that tends to be the focus of these conversations, when the focus ought to be on reducing NOx emissions, toxic emissions. The pollutants basically contribute to ozone and PM 2.5 that's significantly adverse public health. I'm not underplaying the significance of the challenge, but there's real results and progress, and California is unprecedented in how it's moved forward.
Got it. Thank you, Senator Dolly. Mr. Corey, if I could just ask a clarifying question to Mr. Dolly's comment, because I think Mr. Dolly might be referring to what I'm thinking of as page 32 and 33 of the auditor's report, where it was reported in our budget committees that you would need to pay out 2.1 million rebates, which is roughly about $5.6 billion, to get 5 million more ZEVs, on the road just to meet the governor's executive order. So I was just trying to figure out, how did CARB come up with the $5 billion in public funding to achieve that if they didn't have the data that the auditor's report is saying that you're lacking?
No, thank you, Chair. And this was straight up. It was a question that we responded to with a fairly simplistic response. Basically, it was assuming a certain percentage of individuals that purchase a ZEV seek CVRP, and it was basically doing the straightforward math, basically saying the same individuals would be eligible, they'd be eligible to receive the same amount, and that was the basic math. So I would characterize it as it was a exercise. It probably overstated the dollars to get to that number, but I think we defined the basic inputs to get to that basic question. And the auditor, Mark, his characterization was fair in terms of the way he said that we responded to that question.
Got it. So that's to put the ZEVs on through the CVRP program that's currently not funded. Is that correct?
You mean there's not an appropriation in this year's budget, I think is what you mean. There is funding for CVRP still being paid out, but it's currently not in the budget. That's a correct statement, and I know that you all are talking to the administration and Department of Finance.
Correct. Yeah. I'm just saying, if it's a program that works, then the governor probably should have had it in his initial budget, but obviously we want to target those disadvantaged communities with the highest amount of pollution. So I appreciate that, Mr. Corey. And then I didn't hear exactly the answer to Senator Dolly's first question, though, which was the statutory authority to go ahead and adopt the regulations for the banning of the internal combustion engine. Can you tell me where that authority lies, or what you are relying on it for to do that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I actually thought I did respond. First thing I said, we don't ban engines. What we do is we adopt regulations requiring that manufacturers produce a progressively increasing percentage of zero emission vehicles. So those are very different things. But if your question then is, well, on what authority?
Correct.
State authority, toxics authority, criteria pollutants authority, AB 32, Federal Clean Air Act authorities to achieve our ambient air quality standards. So authority for NOx, diesel PM, and DHGs established at both the state and federal level. So multiple citations there.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. It does get a little confusing when we see press releases issued by the various administration agencies and from the different groups that use different language. With that, we're going to go ahead and move to Senator Gonzalez, to Assemblymember Fong, and I know Assemblymember Gibson still has this question from the previous panel.
Thank you,
Please.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Corey. I think you'd mentioned in the very beginning that you are taking action on some of the recommendations and findings from the audit. So can you elaborate on what those actions are so far? I mean, I know that there's a lot in here, but please shed some light on that.
Yes, thank you. We try to break it down in terms of, one, where there are opportunities in the short run to get better quality and more complete data, and what is the mechanism for doing that. One is the solicitations that we go through for a grant, for instance. So including strengthening that explicit language. Two, the grant agreements that we have with administrators or recipients. And three is the data we have in terms of the underlying analysis. So those are the immediate near-term things that jumped out at us where we can strengthen the one, collection of data, and two, the analysis of data that we actually have. There certainly is more, and we have a number of updates that will be required to provide the auditor. But those are the a few examples that jump out to me immediately.
Okay, thank you. And can you speak a little bit to the job training component, because we hadn't heard that in the previous panel, and in terms of, the socioeconomic programs and benefits, we haven't really heard much on what is happening on the job training front.
This is one where I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Burgess, to speak to.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much for the question. So when it comes to the jobs question specifically, I think it was mentioned that the legislation to start collecting that data for all cap and trade funded programs, including the ones that CARB that passed 2015. In 2019, there was a tool that was made available for all of us, and we started using that. So we've started using the tool. We look forward to reporting more jobs data in our upcoming funding plan. And we're currently working internally to beef up our surveys with respect to how exactly we query these different programs to obtain that information. I would like to highlight maybe some of the things that we do currently, but I would like to, of course, underscore that we'll be moving forward and doing a more robust job of ensuring that our grantees collect that data. So per legislative direction, like all agencies, we believe that we've applied the methodology for how to collect this data appropriately, but we'll be looking to beef it up, and we'll be looking to make sure that we include in all our grant agreements that we collect jobs data.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Senator Gonzalez. We'll move to Assemblymember Fong, and then to Assemblymember Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to follow up on some questions from my colleague from Kern County in terms of the Clean Vehicle Assistance Rebate Program, which provides, as you know, grants and affordable financing to help income-qualified Californians purchase new or used hybrid and ZEVs, right? So just so I'm clear, are all ZEVs eligible to receive grants under this program?
I'm going to ask Dr. Burgess to again respond. It's a program she'll have more detail on.
Correct. So through the statewide financing assistance program, there's a variety of different vehicles that are allowed to participate, everything from hybrid to plug-in vehicles. Again, I've heard this characterized as a loan program, and I do want to underscore that this is really a loan loss program. So we look to partner with banks to make sure that they have the backing that's needed to provide competitive rates to folks who wouldn't necessarily be able to access that otherwise.
Okay. So then, I'm sure you're aware, and I guess maybe you can just clarify. So when I looked up at the website, the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program website, as of August 2020, there was 725 grants for a total of $3.4 million in spending. And then last week, as of January 2021, I guess maybe that's the most recent on the website, there was 1,728 grants for a total of $8.3 million. And I'm sure it appears that there's thousands of other additional applications pending, so I guess that number could be maybe $10 million as of today. Are you aware of that surge of applications?
Yes, this has been a very popular program, and we've experienced this surge before. And so, right now we're at the point where 2,800 low-income vehicle buyers have received loans. And not to break the news early, but we will be going into reservation mode for this program shortly.
So then what is the income eligibility of these individuals that are, of these grants, do you know the average income of those applying?
The average income of participants is $39,000 with an average household size of just over 2 people.
But if you're a family of 4, that income limit would go up to like 104,000? Is that correct? Is my interpretation correct?
I'm so sorry. I would need to double check that and get back to you.
So it's my understanding that there was a change that increased the income limit to 400% of the federal poverty level. So that if there was a family of 4, on the website it said that your income eligibility would be $104,000. Is the website incorrect?
Correct. Yes, the 400% of federal poverty level is correct. And the number I was giving you previously was based on actual applicants. So in terms of our actual participants, the average income level there is $39,000. And yes, you are capped at 400% of federal poverty level for participation.
Okay. And then was that 400%, was that a recent change, or was that always there in the program? Was that income limit increase, was that always there, or was that changed recently?
I'll need to double check. Thank you for the question. We'll get back to you.
So you don't know if the program changed or not?
The program recently reopened. As I mentioned, we experienced a surge previously. And so in the last year, we have reopened the program to go statewide. But it has always been 400% for financing assistance.
Okay. I guess my concern is, do you have safeguards to ensure that those applying for loans and rebates, that they are indeed, low income?
Yes, great question. So yes, we do have those safeguards in place. We do partner with our grantees to make sure that we are doing checks to make sure that the income eligibility requirements are met. And this is true across our programs, financing assistance or otherwise.
So could you outline what those safeguards would be, or what they are?
I'm happy to look into the specific documentation that we ask of our participants.
Okay. I mean, this is certainly a concern, right? Given this is what Senator Bradford was outlining, is that, I'm asking you pretty basic questions. And I guess, we want people to be eligible, and we want the right people to be utilizing the program, and you don't seem to know what safeguards you have to ensure that there's no fraud and abuse in the program. And I only say that, and I guess it's leading up to this question, which is, I've seen some online comments and some websites that indicated that wealthy customers are accessing the program, and so I don't know if you're aware of that.
Be concerned by those reports, but again, we do income eligibility checks. But if there's specific concerns that this is being gamed somehow, I'm happy to have that discussion with you in your office to better understand the concern.
Okay. And I think this is something that I think I just want to highlight that this is a transparency issue, right? It's like, I want to quote Mr. Corey, which said that he answered Mr. Bradford by saying that every dollar spent by CARB in these programs are well documented and well recorded. So if they're well documented and well recorded, then there better not be any fraud or abuse in this program. And you know, I've also seen on comment boards and on online message boards that individuals are purchasing the $2,000 home charger credit, or utilizing the charger credit, buying chargers, portable chargers, and then selling them on eBay. That's certainly not allowed in the program, I'm assuming.
Again, I'm happy to look into these allegations. I mean, you're bringing up some things that I find very, very concerning, and so I'm interested in looking into that. You know, I do want to underscore the way the financing assistance program works is we go through a pre-approval process for everyone who participates in the program. We look at their income tax data and then approve them to participate. So if that is not occurring in the way that I lined out, or you're aware of some gaming, I would welcome to have the conversation.
Okay. I mean, I certainly don't want another audit, but it sounds to me that you know, there may be some loopholes and there may be some safeguard challenges, and this is very disconcerting that you know, you're not outlining a safeguards or the system of safeguards in a program you're touting as successful. And so that's very troubling to me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I apologize. I may be a little bit nervous, but I guess the thing that I'm trying to do my best to underscore is that we do pre-approve every application. We do check income tax returns and work to pre-approve applicants before they participate in the financing assistance program. I'm not aware of any proof of gaming the system, but again, always open to a conversation around more data.
And I look. I mean, I do intend to put you on the spot and other people in CARB, but I think these are very important questions as we discuss. I mean, if there is a discussion within the legislature of putting more money into this program, I think we're going to have to address these challenges. Can I ask how much is left in the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program? How much left is to be expended?
So in the financing assistance program, as I mentioned, we are about to run out of money and about to announce that we're entering into a reservation mode. So as you mentioned, there has been a surge on the program, and we want to make sure that those who are in the queue are being covered. So the program is rapidly running out of resources.
And so how much would be spent this whole program? How much is that? How much are you guys anticipating spending? Because I mean, going back to what the chair had indicated, if what is it? What was your numbers? 80% was going to the Bay Area, and 20 less than 10% was going to Kern County, and he and I represent the same area. So we certainly are. I'm very sensitive to the fact that if this program is technically working, well, it's not working in Kern County. So if you could provide me that information, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Fong. We're going to move to Assemblymember Gibson, who is participating remotely. Let me ask if there's additional members that have questions participating remotely, if they could just send me a quick message. A text would be most efficient. And so we'll move to Assemblymember Gibson.
Thank you very much, Chairman Gonzalez. I would absolutely like to get a response to Assemblymember Fong's question regarding how much money is left in the program. I would think that you appeared before this committee. This question will be greatly anticipated as part of your presentation. So can you find this information, call somebody, and find out there's enough for you on this line that somebody should be texting somebody a response to Member Fong's question that I am absolutely curious to hear a response to.
So it's possible I'm not understanding the question, but there's been about 14.
How much money is left in the program?
Hey, Sid, let me try and take a stab because I think I am tracking the question because there's 3 programs and they were talked about differently. With respect to CVRP, it's about 25 million left. With respect to low income CVRP, we just moved, it's about 25 million. So both of those are about, I'm in the ballpark, Sid, you can correct me, but I think that was the question is what are the remaining dollars in those two programs, and that those are approximate, and I will follow up with the precise numbers, but those are approximate on the spot responses. It should be correct.
And as I understand, Sydney indicated that you're going to have to go into reserve mode, or because these monies are getting ready to run out. Was that correct?
That
So
is. Go ahead.
Just to interject very quickly, I had thought we were talking about the statewide financing assistance program, which is about to go into reservation mode, and we only have about $2 million left there, hence the reservation mode. Mr. Corey mentioned how much we have left remaining in the CVRP pot. If there's other programs on the table that you're interested in dollar amounts, I'm happy to chime in there, but apologies if I've caused confusion.
Great. Moving on, I want to align my comments with Senator Bradford. I just feel absolutely, since I've been elected, CARB has, I believe, in my opinion, has totally disrespected this legislature. It's like you have a badge to do whatever you want to do, irrespective of this legislature. For that reason, let me pose this question. For those programs which are intended for socioeconomic benefits, the audit finds that it would expect CARB to demonstrate program valued by clearly defining and measuring socioeconomic benefits. It sounds like CARB has many of the tools available, but such as the clean car for all survey, but it failed to require it. My question to Mr. Corey, can you explain why CARB has failed in its statutory obligation?
Yeah, Assemblyman, let me first make an important point, because your focus is rightly so on social, economic, social justice issues. With respect to clean trucks, with respect to clean cars for all, those vehicles are operating in low-income communities. The communities around the state that are saying the number one issue, and I've been up and down the state on AB 617, the number one issue is concern about dirty trucks in their communities. These dollars substantially are cleaning up trucks. Not enough dollars, because there are a lot of trucks, getting cleaner trucks on the road, reducing diesel PM. The Clean Cars for All program you called out, directed at low-income folks, getting them in much cleaner, lower-emitting vehicles. Now, with respect to your jobs question, and it was a fair criticism, are we collecting data from consumers that participate in the program about the economic benefits in addition to the clean car that they got? That's challenging. And my point is, I acknowledge it straight up. Getting that data, it was not complete. We need to get it. And some consumers may be not as willing to share it because of personal information related issues. But, I am committed to follow up and basically have surveys that ask that data. So it's not about the cleaner vehicles. They're getting them. It's about, does getting the cleaner vehicle create other opportunities, jobs, and so on? That data is much more challenging to get at, and we're going to focus on it.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if I may follow up just one last question.
Please.
Given the auditor's finding, the fact that this body is in the process of adopting some cap and trade expenditures via early action, how can the legislature justify expending $200 million before the audit's recommendations are adopted?
Well, Assembly member, clearly, ultimate appropriation is in the administration's court. But I would make this observation, and I think it's an important one. California has the worst air quality in the United States and has made enormous progress, undeniable progress, as the population increased, the number of vehicles and so forth. People from around the country and around the world come here to see how we're doing it. In addition to those improvements, and we still have areas that have much more improvement, California is a magnet for clean car manufacturers, zero emission trucks, zero emission forklifts, zero emission buses. It is a direct response from the leadership of the legislature and its commitment to clean air and the fact that it is supporting programs, incentive programs that are serving as a magnet for manufacture and jobs coming to California. And you don't have to believe me. Look at the LA Economic Development Corporation and other economic outfits that look at this data independently and say the same thing.
All right. All right. Thank you. I believe that concludes your questioning, Mr. Gibson.
Yes, right now.
All right. Thank you. We're going to return it back to you, members on the dais. I just had two quick clarifying questions. One that was raised earlier about the accountability. A lot of this is stemming from the lack of data that was outlined in the auditor's report, needing some of this data. It was indicated that CARB has the funding, the authority, and some of these third-party contracts to track the efficacy of some of the programs we're discussing today. But I just wanted to get your perspective, Mr. Corey. Why isn't the data available if you guys are contracting with individuals to provide this data?
Well, the follow-up is, what data are you talking about? Because let me be crystal clear on this. Data on the vehicles that are being funded, whether they're new or used cleaner vehicles, the data on where those vehicles are going, the total benefits, emission reductions of the overall program. That's all data that's collected and reported, and our emission inventory. I think the real question that really got to the heart of this is some of that harder data to collect, quality data, and do it in a comprehensive way. By virtue of participating in the Clean Cars for All, determining that low-income individual, did it create new job opportunities? Did their credit score increase? That's the kind of data that we don't have. And we're going to have to try and get it. And honestly, we may not be the best agency to collect that. It may be workforce and labor development. Some of the legislators posed that question. We're going to need help on that. And I've reached out to some legislators and others really exploring how can we fully be responsive to the auditor's questions and do it in an effective and meaningful way, and do it in an area where we have sufficient expertise. Job creation, that's not a CARB area of expertise, and there certainly are people that make careers out of this that we're already talking to. We're going to need some help.
Got it. No, and I appreciate that, because at the end of the day, we're just trying to make sure we're getting the most bang for the buck. And if we're trying to collect this data to effectuate change in some of these most disadvantaged communities, most polluted communities, and obviously the data helps direct the policy and the funding to get the goals, the climate goals, and really the hopefully the positive health aspects we can have in some of these most disadvantaged communities. So, I think at the end of the day, a lot of us are looking for, environmental justice equity for these non-attainment, highly polluted communities around the state. Let me just ask one final question, and that's just of the audit. The audit made a number of recommendations, I believe around 14, and I just wanted to ask, are you planning on implementing all of those? Because obviously we're going to do the check-ins that the auditor comes back and checks in on the progress of all the recommendations outlined in the audit. And what steps have you taken to address some of those recommendations, and where are you planning on implementing all of the auditor's recommendations?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And to the short answer to your question, do we plan to implement the recommendation? We certainly do. And the auditor, though, as you know, as you're well familiar with, there's periodic reports that we will be uploading to the auditor's site at the 60-day mark. That's next month, the 6 month and year, and annually thereafter. To your question, and Family Member Gonzalez asked this too, there's some things we can do in the short run, right? In terms of adjusting grant agreements going forward, solicitations. But and we will respond to every one of the requirements that were called out, but the degree to which we can respond and how complete. For instance, let me assure you, the 60-day response is not going to be as complete as I'd like it to be. It's 2 months. We'll have moved forward. We'll have strengthened the report. The 6 month will be stronger. The year will be stronger than that. And we're already reaching out to others, other experts. How can we be fully responsive to the auditor's recommendations and do it in a way that honestly acknowledges the challenges that I talked about, which include how do you disentangle what motivates a consumer to make a decision when there's multiple programs that interact. That's not an issue of whether we're getting a new car on the road or we're getting reductions. It's how are you attributing those benefits? That's complex behavioral economics, and we're looking for some help to break it down and work through it.
Yeah, we understand those challenges. Thank you, Mr. Corey. I think from some of the members questioning those, they wanted to make sure that those programs were benefiting individuals in lower socioeconomic situations. And I know some of the Assembly members brought up incomes over 100, 6 figures, and they seem to be skewed towards helping those individuals with higher incomes as opposed to lower incomes. So we're going to look very eagerly at the next upcoming reports, but just keep that in mind that a number of the legislators that you heard here today are looking at those low socioeconomic status and how the programs are benefiting the intended places. I brought up the example of 80% earlier being spent outside of the disadvantaged community, but those are the types of things I think I continue to hear from several members of the legislature. All right, with that, let me ask if you have any concluding remarks. I don't believe there's any more questions.
I do not, Chair.
Okay. Well, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate that. With that, we're going to go ahead and continue on to agenda item number 4, which is the public comments. And I believe we have an operator on the line. Operator, do we know how many public comments we have in queue?
Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to comment, press 1 then 0 now. Again, if you wish to comment, press 1 then 0 now. And just to let you know, so far there are about 10 in the queue.
Okay, thank you, operator. Let's go ahead and move to the public comments section. If you could please limit your comments to less than 2 minutes. Please identify yourself, and if you're with an organization, please tell us which organization that is. If you are not with an organization, please tell us which county you reside in as you proceed with your public comments. But please try to limit your comments to 2 minutes, and if what you're saying has already been said, please indicate that as well so we can move quickly. Thank you.
All right, so we'll first go to line number 12. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair and members. My name is Dan Nadash. I'm speaking on behalf of Zeem Solutions, an owner-operator of zero-emission vehicle depots locating in trucking corridors in disadvantaged communities. We lease, sell, domicile, and maintain medium and heavy-duty zero-emission trucks and shuttles under service agreements. HVIP purchase incentives remain necessary and vital for the zero-emission truck market, especially at the still very early stage of adoption and adaption, and particularly for medium and smaller fleet operators. Not only are these incentives critical to spurring continued adoption, providing greenhouse gas mitigation and air quality benefits, they are helping to build and support a workforce ecosystem of California jobs in zero-emission trucking, maintenance, and servicing, particularly in those areas most overtly impacted. On behalf of Zeem, I thank you for your leadership, time, and attention.
All right, thank you for your public comments. Let's move to the next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 14. Please go ahead.
Hi, good evening, Chair and members of the committee. This is Meredith Alexander on behalf of CalSTART. We are a member-based nonprofit. And also, for full disclosure, we are the administrator of the HVIP Heavy-Duty Voucher Incentive Program. I reside in Sacramento County, but we are headquartered in Los Angeles County. Tonight, you've heard a lot about CVRP and the CARB equity programs, which are equally important to CalSTART, but we did want to speak a bit more about the heavy-duty programs, which are also discussed in the auditor's report. CalSTART advocates for an ecosystem approach to decarbonizing transportation, and we really emphasize across the country and around the world the need for incentives that are also paired with regulations, and that's giving direction to manufacturers and fleets. We find the auditor's report in some cases really misstates the causes and effects for medium and heavy duty ZEV purchases, zero emission vehicle purchases, and also overlooks major clean air and economic benefits of clean vehicle programs broadly. I'm sure hopefully they're still on the line. You'll hear directly from some other businesses like Dan who have purchased vehicles with the assistance of HVIP, as well as manufacturers bringing these very advanced vehicles to market.
Thank you.
They are, thank you.
Thank you. All right, next public comment, please.
Next, we'll move to line 27. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, committee members. Chris Shimoda with California Trucking Association. Wanted to respond to just one part of the audit regarding whether zero-emission commercial trucks would be purchased in the absence of incentives. As you may know, CARB currently proposes to require nearly all commercial trucks in California to be zero-emission by 2040. Given that the vast majority of trucking companies are small businesses, and given that zero-emission trucks are typically 2 to 3 times more expensive than a traditional diesel, incentives to buy down vehicle and charging infrastructure costs are a crucial part of the state strategy to deploy zero-emission trucks. Commercial trucks are very different than cars, as are the decisions that go into what technology to purchase. Commercial trucks must make economic sense for their operators, and incentives are a crucial part of making the bottom line work. We support the audit's call for greater transparency, but also highlight the need overall for significantly more incentives, up to billions of dollars more, to support California's truckers in this effort to deploy zero-emission trucks. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 13. Please go ahead.
Good evening. Matt Broad on behalf of the State Building and Construction Trades Council of California. I wanted to briefly express our dismay regarding some of the findings from the audit, particularly around the board's failure to evaluate the effects of its programs on required job creation and training. As you know, CARB's programs have dramatic impacts on the livelihoods of our members, as well as for other industrial transportation sector unions. For this reason, it's particularly troubling to read, despite clear direction mandates requiring job data reporting, CARB is only keeping up for a small fraction of its incentive programs. Likewise, when CARB does include job training as a program benefit, does not always require its program administrators to provide detailed information about the training or how it benefits participants. Given the numerous ways CARB programs impact our members' jobs, the board's indifference to job creation and training is certainly troubling. We would ask that the board work to immediately remedy these inadequacies moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 36. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Bill McGavran with the Coalition for Clean Air. We sponsored the bill that requires investments in disadvantaged communities, so this topic is of great interest to us, and we agree with the auditor that we need more data, particularly on impacts on consumer behavior, on quantifying socioeconomic benefits like jobs, and on demonstrating benefits to disadvantaged communities. While this analysis goes forward, we should not have paralysis of analysis, and we need to continue the programs that are benefiting disadvantaged communities. Chairman Salas, you have been a big supporter of Clean Cars for All, which is providing clean, safe mobility for a lot of people in your district and other disadvantaged communities around the state. And we need to make sure that programs like that are continued to be funded. Secondly, we are concerned about falling short of our emission reduction needs for air quality and greenhouse gases. So we urge the legislature to do more to reduce emissions from oil refineries and to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And finally, it's a mystery to me why this audit is so focused on greenhouse gas emissions and so little on air quality and public health. Many of you members have talked about your concern with air pollution, but you didn't ask the auditor to address that, and that's a big disappointment to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 17. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Daniel Broad on behalf of Sierra Club, California. The audit results suggest that California needs to do a lot more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector if we're ever going to meet our goals and slow the climate crisis. Even though the audit focused on GHGs, we also know that we need to get fossil-fueled combustion engines off the road if we're ever going to clean up the state's notorious air pollution. Expecting a single agency to solve this crisis is unrealistic. The legislature needs to take more aggressive action to replace polluting fossil fuel vehicles with zero-emission vehicles. The legislature must take bold actions such as supporting the governor's clean transportation budget proposal and cannot afford to support half measures like so-called near-zero vehicles. All state agencies and the legislature must do more to protect our planet and communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 39. Please go ahead.
Good evening, chairs and members of the committee. My name is Lillian Mervis with the Center for Sustainable Energy. I'm calling today in support of CARB's clean transportation projects, which are needed to reach the state's climate and air quality goals as discussed today. As a program administrator for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, or CVRP, we at Center for Sustainable Energy can speak to the qualitative benefits of CVRP that were not included in the audit. In addition to the quantitative rebate statistics dashboard that's publicly available on CVRP's website, CVRP utilizes a survey to collect participant behavioral data as shown in the audit. We concur that this data should be made publicly available to emphasize the socioeconomic benefits of the program, and this survey is only one of many instruments CVRP uses to collect data. We want to continue publicizing data on this program to share the benefits of CVRP and that it brings to all Californians. Lastly, we're proud of the changes made to CVRP by the legislature and CARB to emphasize equity over the last 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 31. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Ross Buckley on behalf of Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. We also wanted to voice our support for the HVIP program, which helps agencies like ours procure zero-emission buses faster. HVIP makes them less cost-prohibitive so we can deploy zero-emission fleets. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 21. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair and members, for the chance. I'm Jim Castellas, founder and Chief Technology Officer at Motive Power Systems. I started about 12 years ago. We've grown to employing about 100 people, most in California, running 2 small manufacturing facilities in Hayward and Stockton. We provide all electric trucks and buses. As I like to say, we free fleets from fossil fuel, but we don't do it alone. We rely heavily on CARB's HVIP program. I think 44% of our California electric truck and bus orders wouldn't happen without HVIP. Those customers would buy gasoline and diesel. One example is a bakery in Alameda who's seeing increased demand during COVID. They want to go electric, but they're only able to consider it because of HVIP. Another are 9 electric trucks for the Community Resource Project in Sacramento. They're deployed, providing home energy audits, weatherization, and HVAC services to low-income residents in the area of Sacramento, and that area is some of the worst in the country. And then Bimbo Bakeries, largest bakery in the world, they're now rolling out electric delivery trucks, targeting 100 to 200 per year based on the success of 25 electric trucks that they bought only due to HVIP. Without that, those would be gasoline, and these next ones would also be gasoline. Most of our customers domicile their vehicles in lower-rent urban areas, so the impact on disadvantaged communities has been large. Most of these vehicles impact those communities heavily. And, really I would say this program isn't just putting electric trucks on the road. It's really reframing electrification as a viable option for these fleet customers as they look to the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Sure, and just to give you an update, we have about 7 left in the queue. We'll next move to line 37. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Will Barrett with the American Lung Association. Thank you for the opportunity.
We agree that CARB could provide more data and analysis to ensure the programs are working together to maximize benefits, especially in our disadvantaged communities. We also know that we want to see these benefits reflected in terms of reductions in criteria, air pollutants, and toxic air contaminants, and public health benefits that were not included in the scope of the audit. So when everyone's talking, and we're talking today about the societal benefits, the public health benefits of regulations and investments are missing here. Again, these are not included in the scope of the audit, and that, I agree, is disappointing. As noted at the outset of this meeting by Mr. Salas, Kern County has the most difficult air pollution challenges in the United States, according to the Lung Association's annual State of the Air report. Over the 20 years of our report, Kern County has benefited greatly from reductions driven by California Air Resources Board regulations and local measures. But we know there's a long way to go, and that's why the Lung Association believes that California must do more and do more quickly to protect public health and reduce criteria air pollutants and toxic air contaminants. That's why we believe CARB should set the strongest technologically feasible standards to clean our air, and that the incentives that the legislature approved should accelerate the benefits of faster turnover to electric vehicles, especially in our most impacted communities, like those envisioned through the Clean Cars for All program and the heavy-duty electric truck and bus program. CARB can also do more to track and detangle the benefits of regulatory versus investment programs, but we do have to ensure that the agency is equipped to do that without distracting from its public health mission. That's a mission that's shared by the American Lung Association. We look forward to CARB reporting out on these corrective actions and correcting course as needed. So we also, in closing, call on the legislature to not only provide guidance to CARB on tracking and analysis, but to support CARB in strengthening and accelerating direct emission reduction measures, investing in the transition to zero emission technologies and infrastructure, and healthier, more sustainable communities that afford all residents with more efficient and healthier transportation choices that will clean our air and provide those societal benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's proceed with the next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 20. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Virgil Looney, and I'm the Deputy Director at Beneficial State Foundation. I'm commenting in support of CARB's transportation programs, in particular the equity programs. Beneficial State Foundation is the program administrator for the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, which has also been referenced in this conversation as the Financing Assistance Statewide Program. The past year has shown without a doubt more than ever that Californians are struggling and they benefit from upfront financial assistance, especially right now, and that was prior to this past year. I appreciate the insights offered from the auditor's report, and I agree that collecting, tracking, analyzing, and reporting quantitative data is critical. And I want to reassure folks on this call and participating in the session that we do, in fact, collect data, a lot of data, and in particular, something that came up earlier, and I might have misheard or misunderstood, is that we do track the loans that are reported through the vehicle purchase contract that participants and dealers have to submit in order to receive the grant. That's a key piece of the data that we collect. And with that being said, I know that we can improve it, and I think that we should improve it. I also feel that some core pieces of our program were missing from the auditor's report on the qualitative data side, and I wish that had been more represented. I'm committed to the continuous improvement of the CVA program, and I'm excited to continue tackling the challenges around data collection and management. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 40. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Elise Vondrick on behalf of the California League of Conservation Voters. And we want to echo the comments from the other environmental organizations that were made here and to support the necessary programs that are needed to reduce emissions and meet our 2030 reduction targets. So we agree that with the auditor that more data is needed. And we just view this audit as an invitation for this body to take an active role in determining really what data and tools CARB needs to ensure that the state is actually meeting these goals and then deliver the resources needed to achieve those targets. And importantly, we don't want to prematurely question the efficacy of these programs when there's a conclusion that more data is needed. So with that in mind, while cost effectiveness is important to consider, we want to highlight our support towards efforts to pinpoint and collect specific data that could be collected to better evaluate other socioeconomic benefits of these programs, like job creation and health, as well as equity. So thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 34. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi. My name is Dawn Fenton, and I'm here to represent Volvo Group North America. We are involved in the Volvo Lights project, bringing battery electric trucks into commercial service in Southern California, and we own Mack Trucks that has developed an electric refuse truck. I'm here to respond to the audit report's question about whether CARB's incentive programs influence customers' behavior. Factors influencing purchase decisions about light-duty vehicles are vastly different than those influencing heavy-duty fleets. With regards to heavy-duty vehicles in the HVIP program, I can state beyond a doubt that the program supports sales that would not happen without it. We have had multiple cases where customers have stipulated their purchase based on the ability of obtaining HVIP incentives. These instances were related to past sales of natural gas vehicles. Now that we have commercially available zero-emission battery electric vehicles, which are exponentially more expensive than diesel vehicles, the HVIP program has become even more critical to the decision of fleets to purchase them. We have battery electric Class 8 trucks for sale today, which are available for delivery this year. I'm here to emphasize that without robust support for purchase incentives like the HVIP program, fleets will not purchase these vehicles, thereby undermining the governor's stated goals for heavy-duty ZEV penetration in the marketplace and the air quality of its citizens, particularly in disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 42. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. David Gonzalez on behalf of EMA, the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. EMA is the global trade association whose members include the manufacturers of medium and heavy-duty trucks and engines. We're very proud of the amazing innovations our manufacturers are making in the areas of reducing emissions and the deployment of ZEVs and other emerging technology in the medium and heavy-duty sectors. However, it's probably to no one's surprise that these new technologies are currently a lot more expensive than what's currently in the market for the transportation sector. This is particularly significant in the area of the medium and heavy-duty vehicle markets, since these vehicles are primarily purchased as capital investments, and therefore the purchaser is expected to return their investment. Excuse me. As it relates to the auditor's report, we think it would be an unfortunate takeaway from the report that the incentive programs do not induce consumer behavior. In fact, these incentive programs do, in fact, do that. Our members agree that the important incentive programs like HVIP are critical in inducing some fleets to purchase ZEVs, and that for many of these purchases would not have happened but for the incentive programs like HVIP. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and we look forward to working with you and the other policymakers on this important conversation.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 47. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Chair and members. Jose Carmona representing the Blue-Green Alliance of California. The Blue-Green Alliance is a network of organized labor and environmental organizations working towards an equitable, high-road, and low-carbon economy. First, we would like to share our strong support for CARB's incentive programs and policies that accelerate market transformation in clean vehicle manufacturing and equitable ZEV deployment. While we strongly support these programs, we feel it is important that this committee signal to CARB, in addition to other key agencies, that it is an economic imperative that clean energy business investments translate into quality and high-road jobs for both incumbent and disadvantaged workers. We concur with some of the recommendations in the California Auditor's report, notably the need to establish comprehensive mandatory public metrics focused on job quality outcomes. We additionally strongly recommend that the committee highlight the necessity of proactive workforce policies in addition to improved reporting. These policies should include workforce standards such as industry-specific or economy-wide wage and benefit standards, skill certification requirements, enforcement of all labor and employment laws, including the proper classification of employees, collective bargaining rights, and domestic content requirements. We live in a transformational moment in which we can leverage high-road jobs across the low-carbon vehicle supply chain. Let's use our strategic advantages, including our growing market for ZEVs, our public incentives, and our strategic mineral supply, particularly in the Salton Sea resource area, to build a high-road EV economy here in California. Better reporting alone will not ensure the quality of jobs funded by essential CARB vehicle incentives. Workforce standards can and should. Better wages, benefits, working conditions, and career ladders support a more skilled workforce and will not only help the state reach its climate goals, but support working families along the way. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Carmona. Haven't heard your voice in a while. It's good to hear it. Let's move on to the next public comment, please.
Next, we'll go to line 45. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chairman Salas and members of the committee. My name is Jamie Levin, and I'm with the Center for Transportation and the Environment in Berkeley, California. And we are project managers of a number of major heavy-duty deployments, both transit buses and trucks throughout California that are very specifically targeted to serving disadvantaged communities. In fact, in the area of transit specifically, we have routes that are designated to operate in the top 25% of the DACs identified by the Cal Enviro Screen 3.0. And in those deployments and demonstrations, we are collecting extensive data and evaluating performance, sending that data to CARB, looking at both emissions reductions and, as I said, technology performance. And the purpose of that performance evaluation is to be able to show that these zero-emission technologies are moving in the direction of full commercialization. And to give you an example, we have deployed a number of fuel cell electric transit buses that are performing at a level that transit agencies throughout the state are recognizing as an important complement to battery electric. And that is now transitioned from the specific transit agencies we've been working with in Northern and Southern California to the Central Valley as well. We're working with Golden Empire Transit in Bakersfield to deploy hydrogen electric fuel cell transit buses. Lastly, I want to say that CARB has been really a key component to making this possible with the way they have managed the funds and distributed the funds for the purpose of us effectively transitioning to zero emission. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
And next, we'll go to line 43. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Chair. Erin Rodriguez with Union of Concerned Scientists. This audit clearly outlines that the state needs to be doing more to reduce greenhouse gases with a mix of policies that include mandates, incentives, and infrastructure investments to achieve its climate goals and address the ongoing climate crisis. I'm aligning my comments with the American Lung Association about this audit being narrowly scoped and not examining criteria air pollution, which we believe was a missed opportunity. Additionally, greenhouse gas reductions per dollar spent is not the only metric that we want to use when evaluating effectiveness of programs. Socioeconomic benefits should also be examined as called out in the report. While we may need to get more granular in our understanding of data, it's not an excuse to slow down, but rather a call to speed up our investments and reductions. There needs to be more aggressive actions, incentives or otherwise, in order to meet 2030 goals. We agree that ARB should do more to reduce emissions, and the legislature should help with that through actions throughout this legislative and budget session. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Next public comment, please.
And at this time, there's no one else in the queue.
All right, thank you. I'll return it back to the dais. Let me ask if there's members of the public here that wish to provide public comment. Okay, hearing and seeing none, we will conclude the public comment section of the agenda and move to the close of the committee. I am going to look at the clock, and it is 6 p.m., and we're going to go ahead and conclude the Joint Legislative Audit, Assembly Transportation, and Senate Transportation Committee informational hearing. Thank you.